We see a green mountain in the background and a huge tree stands in front of us. This building was one of the top 4 hunter training schools. It was called Valhalla. Inside the building, many people who were standing and holding weapons were looking ahead. Every year, countless hunters wanted to enter this prestigious place. In the trials, there was a mountain of beaten hunters lying on top of each other. The admission rate to this academy was 500 to 1. Then there were people who coped with the task and looked ahead. Less than 150 people could graduate from an academy called Valhalla. Entrance exams started immediately after the briefing. After that, someone kicks another person, and the ladder blocks it. Then there were a lot of other people who were in their cabins and practiced blows. After that, we see a man who watched it all through a transparent window as people trained. He stood there looking at it all with an intelligent expression. It was the senior instructor of the Valhalla Academy. His name was Lee Sang-cheol. I looked to the side, and someone said that there was quite a lot this time. Lee turns to the side and sees a young man in a suit walking up to him. This man was the Yushan family's heir, Jun. Lee looked at him with a stern face and said that there would probably be a lot more interesting things to do in the admission process. He asked Wu if the wrong person had come here to see his niece. After which, Jun leaned forward and looked forward, and he said that it was really like his Yashina family expected a little from their Soyan. Lee looked ahead, and Yushan said softly to his wingman. Then Lee thought about it and started thinking about Soyan. It was a young student with purple hair and matching eyes. She was a genius who was born into the Yushan family, which ranked among the top 5 families. She was able to master mana and was comparable to her mother and the seniors at the age of 10 and was already able to use weapons deftly. She could have added her mom to her ball at the age of 13. At the age of 16, she expressed herself with her family members and stood over defeated relatives, and no one I could win. Lee looked ahead and said what it said in her personnel file. After which, he looked at you and asked if there was any other information that he didn't know yet. Jun sighed calmly and said what people said about Soyan being able to communicate with their family's guardian constellation. Lee is shocked to hear the information that Jun told him. Jun asked him if he could believe it. Lee asked him if it was true. Jun smiled and looked in his direction and said that it was true, which was why they expected so much from her. After which, a bright notice appeared in the sky, and the reason why there were 5 families in Korea was because of the guardian constellation associated with each of them. There were unknown people who were covered in electric lightning. Usually, a hunter would receive a blessing or contract with the guardian constellation, but the guardian constellation of the 5 families was different from the other constellations. Today, a man who held a katana in his hands. This was the Yushan family's sword god. Following which, there was a man who was holding a bright purple spear in his hand. It was the Jangsan family's holy spear. After which, we see a half-naked man holding a red sword in his hands. It was the Dao King of the Choyjan family. Next up was a man who extended his fist forward. It was the Asen family's fistfight king. Then we see a man who was wearing a green cloak and hat and was pulling a bowstring. This was the Dajin family's bow god. There were 5 dark silhouettes standing next to each other, and all the members of the 5 families were blessed by their constellations. They have gained more talents and abilities than anyone else. Lee stood and listened carefully to everything that was said to him. There was a huge difference between simply receiving a blessing and communicating directly. Guardian Constellation's communication was carried out under a contract with him. Lee folded his hands in front of him and stared straight ahead. He said that if it was true, then she was definitely a genius. Jun looked at his side and extended a finger, saying that he completely agreed with him. Jun kept leaning on the railing, and he asked how his niece was doing. Lee looked at him and said she didn't seem to have started yet. Lee said they would start in about 30 seconds. Jun looked at him with a smile and asked if he could watch it. Lee said if that's what he wanted, then let him go down and take a look. Below, there were a lot of people who were sitting in their seats, watching and filming everything that was happening. Jun looked at it all and said did Lee really want him to go through all these reporters? Jun looked down and asked Lee to just display the image on the screen. Lee looked ahead and said that he thought he was his senior right now. Lee looked ahead with a serious face and said that he would do it because he was also very interested. After which, he stretched out his hand and opened the system panel in the air and began to display the image. He brought up an image and a blue screen appeared in front of them where Soyan was visible. She was standing in front of some guy and was about to pick up her weapon. Jun watched it all and said it's already started. The eldest daughter of the Yushan family, Yushan 17, was there, and some guy from an unknown family, Kim Ju Hyuk. Lee looked at it all with Jun and said that they seemed pretty calm. Jun guessed that the guy had already given up, that his opponent was very strong, and that was why he was so calm. He said that because Soyan's abilities were pretty good, he already knew what was coming. After that, we see Soyan looking at him with a serious look while Ju just stood there yawning. Lee looked at him and said that the guy didn't have any fighting spirit at all. Minjun lowered his head and said with a smile that he was sure it would end quickly. After that, we see the fighters and the report begins. When the countdown started, Soyan immediately rushed to the guy and took out her sword. She started pouring a stream of mana into it and it started to glow and leave a blue light. She swung and threw a punch at the guy and light mana headed in. Lee looked at it all seriously and said that at such a young age, she had very excellent ball possession and also had exceptional control of her mana. The guy was standing there looking at how a trail of mana was heading in his direction. The mark in his stomach was his parasite, but he smiled and got hit. Lee, who had been standing there with a serious face, was horrified. The same thing happened to Minjun, and with all viewers and cameramen. After which, we see a guy holding his fist, which was charged with mana energy, and see Soyan lying on the floor defeated with the ball. The victory went to Kim Ju-hyuk. Ju clenched her fist with her mom and looked away. He didn't understand why everyone was so weak here. He didn't believe that this was really the future after 300 years. After that, we are transported back 300 years and see before us the Tower of Reflection, which glowed. We see two people who were standing opposite each other and they were clearly in a bad state. The guy with the white hair and mask was bleeding profusely, and he laughed. He looked ahead and said it was just a great fight. After which, we hear him being told that the tower was being destroyed and the god of destruction is Barch. It was the guy in front of him. He held his wound, which was bleeding profusely, and it was the martial arts god Kim Hyun-oh. Then he raises his leg and is going to hit Barch on the scaffolding and told him to get out. He hit him with such force that his head simply flew off his body. Barch's body fell to the floor, and Hyun looked at it and left. After that, he looked to the side and the system panel came out in front. He looked there and on the systems on the channel, it was written that he had defeated the boss of the Tower of Destruction Barch. The destruction of the world has been restored. Then an earthquake started and the tower started shaking. Hyun fell to the ground, holding onto the wound that was already bleeding profusely. He looked away not understanding what was going on. He assumed that the tower started to collapse because he killed the boss. After that, he began to writhe from the pain that he was experiencing and once again looked at his wound. He took his hand away and said that he was just going to rest. He looked ahead to where the light was coming from and said that since childhood he had always been busy working as a hunter, and as soon as he earned a lot of money and received recognition, this situation happened. I was walking and wondering if I should have brought my students here. Then he thought about it and realized that he shouldn't have. He looked at Barch's body and said that this side's strength was too high and even if they came, they would have died a dog's death. Then he closed his eyes and smiled. He said that it was just awful, after which a huge rock fell on his head and completely crushed it. After that, he immediately opens his eyes in fright and abruptly gets out of bed. He looks at his hands and his body and can't believe it. It was Kim Hyun-oh, and the body closets of a 17-year-old teenager 300 years after the fall of the Tower of Destruction. After which, he closed his eyes and smiled. In any case, he was quite satisfied when he was reincarnated, even though his body was weaker and his knowledge gained during the time when he was known as the god of martial arts was still intact. After that, he opened the system panel, looked at it, and if he succeeded and adapted to this case, he believed that he could live in luxury and constant rest at least until this semi-transparent system window appeared. It said that in 5 years, the Tower of Destruction would appear and they asked him to prepare. Kim became very angry and started gritting his teeth while holding onto his hair. He didn't understand why, but he assumed that God had a grudge against him. After which, he closed his eyes in front of the system window and said that this Barch should have died. But there was nothing he could do about it now, after which he opened his eyes and looked at the system window again. He thought about it and realized that this time, he would definitely destroy the tower once and for all, and then he would live in the luxury of drinking wine and throwing money around. Then he got up and dressed. He looked ahead and another one system window popped up in front of him. It said, "Please return your weapons and memories." On the 3rd floor, 5 rooms to the right of Valhalla. Kim didn't understand what it meant to bring back the weapons and memories, Valhalla and the Constellation room. He stood in front of the system window and began to think. He put his hand to his chin and said that he understood what was meant by a gunsmith with memories. He had no idea what to do. Then she said that I must first find this place called Valhalla. After that, we are transported to the huge Valhalla building. They said that the 4th day of the competition begins and people who want to take part in the competition must go to the site. Kim was wearing a uniform and he was sitting on a bench. He looked ahead then thought. I looked ahead and wondered if he should go, and then he went out on the field and stood in front of a guy with bandages on his hands. The person who conducted this competition told the opponent to take their seats. The fans cheered and filmed everything that happened. Lee clasped his hands in front of him and said that there were more people today than ever before because the children of all 5 families were here, after which he looked thoughtfully to the side and thought about Kim. He looked at it and said that this badge stood against the Awen family's eldest son Seniak for 17 years. Seniak looked at him with a serious face and said that this person was the one who defeated Yushan in one day. Kim stood kneading her body, looking directly at her opponent. Seniak looked at him and said that outwardly he didn't seem so strong, after which he covered his whole head and closed his eyes and said that it was good because if he could win, his image would go up a lot. Then he called out to him and told him that his boo was coming. After that, the countdown started. Kim looked at him and asked what that meant. Seniak looked at him with a stony face and said that it meant quickly destroy. Kim looked at him with a smile. I said if that's the case then Mom. Seniak asked what it was and Kim pointed at him with a smile and told him to get out of here, then called him names and the match started. We see the eldest son of the Awen family, Seniak, standing with his sleeves rolled up and completely ablaze with fire. He turned around to the side, and he wasn't very good at literature and strategy or martial arts. However, he still had a talent superior to everyone else. He flexed his arm muscles and tore his shirt. His talent was his physique. He was so strong that he was capable of incredible things. He could do all the things that others couldn't do without mana. He trained hard and lifted dumbbells to develop such a talent. He practiced punches on the wall, and even after a lot of training, he still got stronger and stronger every time. He was born with a top-level physique, and he was worthy of being called a genius just because of that. He was completely confident in himself. Then he looked at Kim, who told him with a smile to get out of here. Seniak was extremely displeased with this. His face became very angry, and he clenched his fist with force to attack. He immediately rushed towards Kim and swung his arm, but then he continued to stand still and point at him. Then he stopped poking her and looked at him thoughtfully. He realized that with the body he was born in, he wouldn't be able to win in the fight of Seniak's physiques, as his strength wasn't just an empty phrase. Seniak, very angry, was heading in his direction. Kim said that just because he surpasses him in physique doesn't mean he can beat him. Seniak threw a punch with his fist, but Kim bent down with a calm face and his punch went to the wall. Kim looked at his hand and noticed that his martial arts were supporting the body he was currently in. After that, he lifted his leg and easily with his eyes closed and gave Seniak a pillow, or he fell off his feet. He looked at it all in surprise and fell to the ground. Kim opened one eye slightly and swung his palm. He looked at him with a confident look and smile and said that his ability was to observe the opponent. After that, he made a strong blow to Seniak's body. The impact was so strong that the shockwave seemed to pass through Seniak's body. He passed out from such a blow and started coughing Grozny, after which he fell in front of Kim, who was looking at him. Kim said that if you don't harmonize, it happens. The winner was Kim Ju-hyuk. Kim looked ahead and said that although this body was somewhat weaker before his rebirth, there shouldn't have been any problems with hunting monsters. After which, he headed for the exit while his opponent was lying unconscious on the ground. A lot of people were looking through the big screen at this. Many were dissatisfied and surprised that Seniak was actually defeated. The man began to write something down in a notebook and said that he also did not expect that he would just go on the attack. Then the man behind her raised his hand to his chin and thought. It was the head of the Awen family, the king of fisticuffs. About Chulshan, I called everyone names in my head and didn't understand that people called it a normal attack. He looked ahead and said that even if his son had never been interested in martial arts and only improved his physique, he could easily dodge the fist of any of his peers, much less that guy. He noticed that it was the one punch that he couldn't dodge. He recalled moments in the battle's history, and I realized that he had lost his composure by simply attacking Kim with rage and using magic that he rarely uses to try to finish off an opponent quickly. But Kim, just ducking his head to dodge the blow, and since Seniak thought something was definitely hit, completely shifted to the center of gravity, and Kim easily knocked Fig down with a light footstep, after finishing him off with one punch. The man stood thinking and realized that this meant that the guy was moving faster than Seniak's maximum speed. He noticed that at 2 we go to the guy already formed his own plan. He smiled with an interested look in his clenched her fist and said that it was just a monstrous talent. After his thoughts that were interrupted and he heard the conversation of journalists. They were talking about some outstanding newcomer. Shin looked ahead and said Kim Ju-hyuk's name. He looked at the system images of where Kim was and said that he would definitely make sure to welcome him into their family at all costs. After that, we are transported to the stadium and see a lot of fans who were ardent fans of Choy Aaron Noonan. They shouted and supported her. Kim was standing in the field opposite a girl who had blue hair. He looked away in disgust and asked why they were already adults who had served in the army and called a 17-year-old girl Nuna. He looked at her with a calm look, and it was Kim Ju-hyuk's final match against Choy Aaron. The girl was the second daughter of the Choyjin family. She took up a stance and the match started, after which she reached for her ball while Kim stood quietly and watched it all. The two of them stood idly looking at each other. Kim thought about it after a while and assumed that the girl was waiting for him to attack her. He looked at the girl who was standing in a crouch and was ready to attack with her sword and took action. If she was at least trying to assess the situation, then she was already better than the others. After which, he smiled and asked if he should have done it. Eventually, he started walking slowly towards her with his hands in his pockets. He approached her with a smile, stood in the counter, after which, her sword arm began to fill with mana and flash with lightning. The media fans were shocked. They couldn't believe that a 17-year-old girl could master the Choyjin family's ability. This time, only 5 children from 5 exceptional families attended the event. Kim continued to walk calmly towards her, Arta holding her weapon. Then her eyes glittered, and she knew that this was the time to attack. After which, she took out her sword and launched horizontal strikes towards Kim. During the impact, Kim was left with a dark silhouette, and after the lightning settled, the girl did not understand where he disappeared. After which, he told her that if it showed with her own eyes when she was about to attack, it would be very easy to dodge it. The girl was looking ahead and didn't notice Kim, who was standing at the side and completely dominating the situation, pumping up everything with his aura. The girl turned with surprise and did not understand what it was, after which a blow occurred. The girl tried to block it. Kim looked up and was surprised to see the sword she was holding for protection. Kim, I knew that Na had used the ball because he felt it hit. The girl stood and trembled, looking at her sword, said that it was heavy. After which, Kim walked over to her and slowly leaned his fist against the ball. The girl stood and stared at it without understanding. After that, Kim told someone to go back, and then immediately the shockwave passed through the girl's body and completely came out. Choy didn't expect such a strong technique, and then she started to choke. Kim stood holding his hand in front of him and watched Choy fall to the ground, exhausted. Kim looked at her calmly. Choy lay on the ground and tried to figure out what had just happened to her. She realized that it was true and there was something wrong, and it seemed that her head was off. After that, Kim turned to the side and was the winner. Next, we see the system bulletin board where the top 10 students of Valhalla were ranked, and Kim Joo-hyuk was ranked number 1. Next, we see Kim walking out of Valhalla with his eyes closed, flexing his arm. A second later, many cameramen immediately ran up to him and asked him to listen to them. They very strongly asked him to join their guilds and various businesses. Some of them say that if he joins them, they will provide him with the best possible conditions. They very strongly asked him to do this, which made Kim very angry, and then angrily told them all. After that, we go to the internet article where it was written whether Kim was a crazy psychopath. Underneath was a picture of Kim poking all the people with his fingers with a disgruntled face. The site also said, is it true that after he took first place in the entrance competition, he chased away the guides who made him an offer while swearing? Isn't he on the verge of going crazy? But it was all a lot of people's comments. They said that it was too much because there could be children in a public place. They said he was very rude, but for a novice, she was infuriated. Someone said that if he enters Valhalla, then he probably has a good relationship with many people. Who did you write that if you look at the fact that he destroyed 5 families, then even with such a character, he will be accepted anywhere and will be tolerated. After that, we lead Valhalla and a lot of people who were standing and looking ahead. They stood smiling and listened to the speech they were saying. They were congratulated on entering Valhalla. Kim put his hand to his mouth and yawned. People were saying that Valhalla had a proud 100-year history. Kim looked at all this and said that he was very bored. After which, he thought about it and looked away. Behind him was a guy who was watching him intently. Kim sidled up to the guy, but he quickly turned his head and eyes away from him. Kim stared intently and said that he was too conspicuous so he could be watched so intently. After that, we see Kim walking around the house in his shirt, and the system panel lights up in front of him. It said, please return your weapons and memories on the 3rd floor 5 room to the right of Valhalla. Kim also didn't understand what kind of weapons it perceived, and also didn't understand what kind of flying constellations were. Then we see the blue sky and bright green trees. Kim looked ahead and thought about how he should have just walked in and out and there was no problem. He said he understood something. Then he looked ahead and the entrance ceremony was over. We see a sign that says room for simulating virtual battles. A man with white hair was standing there holding a sign. He looked to the side and asked him what was wrong with the class distribution. This man was the former head of the Choykin Guild of Valhalla instructors, Kim Legong. He looked ahead and saw Soyan from the Yushan family ahead, with Aaron from the Choyjing family standing next to her. The instructors started to look at the people and saw in the crowd Senyuk from the Asen family. He was standing, and everyone who was standing next to him was scared as he radiated a terrible evil energy. The instructor was shocked by this, after which he put his hand behind his head and realized that it was all because the classes were randomly assigned. He couldn't believe that 3 out of 5 families could end up in the 1st grade. After which, he looked to the side and saw the same rookie who took first place in the tournament. The instructor held his hand near his head and couldn't understand why he was also in this class. The instructor realized that K-Dom was completely drawn to this, after which he clenched his fist and closed his eyes and said that he just needed to calm down and act decisively in such situations. After which, he cleared his throat and confidently stood in front and said that he was pleased to meet all the people who were here. Nu looked at his forehead and said that he was the person in charge of this class, and he was also their instructor Kim Lagoon. Then, with an intimidating face, he pressed the button and everything started to change. The students were surprised by this and started looking around, after which the space around them began to change and they moved into the forest. The students were terrified and didn't understand how they got here because they had just been in class. Kim silently looked around at the surroundings, after which the instructor tried and the other took his sword and grabbed it. The instructor said he would show you some blood right here. After something, trolls with clubs all started coming out. The students were terrified and were trapped in a ring. Seniak kept looking at everything with a calm face and realized that there were orcs and goblins here. There were about 100 of them. The goblins continued to look at the students and drool, after which they went on the attack and one of them jumped towards Seniak, but he stayed in the air and bumped into the blue barrier that protected them. The instructor looked at all this with a smile and realized that the barrier was working. The goblin brought and tried to break through the barrier, but it was unsuccessful. Then someone called out to Kim, and the questioner turned around. The instructor told him to come to him. Kim approached the instructor, who pointed at the orcs who were standing behind him behind the barrier and asked if he could take care of these monsters who were here alone. Kim looked over with a calm face and asked if he meant the monsters that were running around here. Ligong said yes, and Kim looked down with a thoughtful face. Ligong looked at all this with a smile and thought that now he was sure that Kim's ego would calm down a little. He thought about the rest of the students and said that they mostly only saw monsters in books or something, but they had never personally encountered them and it was only natural that they were all scared here. Yu looked ahead with a smile and told him to stop pretending to think about it. Ligon just wanted him to say no, and he would start the lesson quickly as soon as his ego calmed down. Kim smiled viciously, and Ligon's expression changed. He looked in the direction of the smiling Kim and said that he saw him laughing. He assumed that he would be able to take care of them himself. Kim said he could handle them easily. Ligon was displeased and assumed that he was still bluffing, so he told Tom to give it a try. Kim stood up with his hands in his pockets and said that from what he knew he hadn't heard that they would be doing something like this on day one. He said that looking at how he was giving him a test suggests that there was some reward for it. Ligon looked down and sighed. He realized that he wanted a reward and Kim looked at him and said that if he took care of all the monsters, he should give him something. Ligon looked at him with displeasure and said that if he took care of all the monsters, he would do whatever he wanted, which was in his power. Kim put his hand to his chin and began to think, after which, he stood up and said that even though it wasn't enough, he accepted the deal with him. He stood in front of him and held out his hand, and Ligon said that he didn't think he understood how things worked here, that a monster in this system was about as likely to be attacked as a real one. Kim said we'll just give him the sword. He looked towards the enraged goblins and asked how he would fight without a weapon. He asked if she really expected him to fight them with his hands alone. Ligon calmly looked his way and grabbed the sword that was behind him and passed it into Kim's hands. Ligon told him to use it. Kim looked at the sword blade with a smile and was satisfied, after which he stood in front of the goblins with his sword on his back, and the barrier that had protected them all gradually broke down, and the goblins began to watch with a smile. Ligong was calmly looking in his direction, and the students were also watching the incident. After which, he started to draw his sword at me and with a vicious smile and piercing gaze, he delivered a vertical strike, punching through many goblins at once. Kim looked intimidating when he saw who was surrounding him and started swinging his sword. He was surrounded by 4 very pumped up trolls who wanted to kill him. Kim didn't get cold feet and immediately pulled out his sword to cut everyone down. During the next attack, he expertly turned to face them as they crept behind him and swung his sword sharply in their faces. From this incredible blow, the ground shook under Kim's feet, but he did not lose himself and continued to fight with them. Hearing the wild roar of Kim, he did not hesitate and drew his sharp sword. Hearing the heart-rending cry, he realized that he had defeated these evil trolls by plunging his sword directly into the throat. Kim was surprised that after 300 years of holding a gun for the last time, he was able to defeat these trolls and it wasn't so bad. Kimmy was flooded with memories after this fight. He recalled how earlier in his childhood he was surrounded by monsters and the world could not perform its role on its own, and he had to use weapons that could be found in the vast expanses of the earth. Sometimes they were even simple rakes, hoes, and even shovels, but still nothing could compare to his sharp sword. After thinking for a long time, Kim became alert and a little distracted. Behind him, he saw a troll that was about to cut him down without a second thought. At the same time, Kim managed to dodge and avoid being hit as he watched the troll drive its sharp axe straight into the ground and the impact pierced his ears. Kim said to himself with a sneer that the troll's actions were completely copied from the template. This monster was just an NPC. As Kim dealt with the last of the victims, the two men watched him closely from the shadows and couldn't believe that he was so strong. Ligon noted that the sword he gave Kim was a very ordinary one. It didn't have any magical powers, but the way it was controlled by Kim was incredible and hard to believe. It seemed to the men that Kim's sword seemed to suck the monsters into the funnel and not let them resist, which allowed him to win with ease. Soyan clutched her hand and sighed, while Senyuk watched this madness and couldn't keep silent. Erin held her collar awkwardly as she watched the entire rampage go on in plain sight. Standing by the mountain of corpses, Kim was completely confident in his strength. Hiding his sword and closing his eyes, he wanted to get into the Constellation team. Turning around confidently, Kim shot his eyes at the man and said, "You keep your promise, right?" In response, he was a little confused and lost in thought, but then there was a sound. Ligon, standing in the center, announced the end of classes and said that everyone was probably tired, so he advised them to go to their dorm rooms and rest. While the kids were leaving and putting the school place in order, Kim fell asleep sitting at his desk, not listening to Ligon at all. When he woke up, he was at a loss as to why the class had taken so long, and he wanted to take what he needed and leave as soon as possible. Once outside, Kim couldn't even imagine that he could teach students, since he had never attended a school before. Kim continued to draw conclusions as he neared the house. Most of all, he remembered the story related to constellations, because in his previous life there was no such thing as a constellation, and it made him think every time. Constellation is a term that has been used to refer to the transformation of those who have achieved great success into gods. They presented themselves as very great people and were always associated with hunters as if they were their holy relics, but they give them special powers that we can't think of. Something from above presents you with the most powerful weapon that will completely distinguish you from the rest with its power. And in fact, Valhalla in Korea is the world's third largest relic of constellations. Kim reasoned along the way and thought that this was the only thing that had power around, and everything about swordsmanship and how to destroy monsters was completely useless. Kim held his collarbone because it hurt. He knew that he should go to the dorm and practice martial arts seriously, but his body is really still weak. Kim looked up at Awen and was very surprised when she suddenly appeared in his path. Meanwhile, in the teacher's office, Sanal and Ligon were having a conversation. While drinking hot coffee, Sanal told him that Ligon had been through a lot. Sanal wasn't happy about it, calling it embarrassment rather than difficulty. Sitting in his office, he began to tell Tom that, in retrospect, it didn't make any sense. The two of them were very much undermined by Kim's incredible strength. After all, 120 monsters were created in the virtual room as a test this time, but he killed all of them and it was hard to believe. A very young high school student who has not yet met a monster coped with all 120 trolls. Ligon's guesses were becoming more and more like reality, and he couldn't believe it. While finishing his coffee, Sangcheol said that he didn't see anything special in Kim Ju and didn't share the opinion of his colleague opposite, and he also noted that Kim is an orphan. He came from a small orphanage in a very dangerous area. This statement greatly surprised Ligon and began to suspect Kim of being a forger in this battle. Raising a glass of coffee, he said that he had done his own research related to this and he was definitely not a forger, especially since Kim definitely wouldn't have poked his fingers with a malicious smile and tried to sneak into Valhalla to stir up a ruckus and mutiny at the performance ceremony. Glancing back at him, he wondered if Kim had actually asked permission to go to Constellation's room himself. The answer was exhaustive. Looking down, Ligon realized that Kim would eventually be able to get where he wanted to go, and he was grateful for the help in getting Kim a ground floor pass. After taking a sip of coffee, he sternly said that he had brought everyone here to announce that he was taking on such a big responsibility. Leaning against the wall, he realized that he didn't know all the information about the closed area on the 5th floor, but anyone can get to the 1st floor, and there won't be any problems if you go inside faster. Ligon sat in his chair without taking a sip, worrying about what might happen next year. Crossing his arms, he asked why he felt that way and if it was related to Kim Ju Hyuk. Continuing to sit on the chair, he did not deny it, but also added that there are 3 students from 5 families in his class and it is not easy to control even one of them. Excitedly, he shouted that he was picking it up and was told that they weren't trying to comfort him, but that there was an exchange student from the Ventrich family in another class. Still flustered and with a shaky voice, he said, "You were talking about that windrunner." Standing with their backs to each other and in a fog of thoughts, they only confirmed each other's guesses. Indeed, it was a direct family of Ventrichs, the same Rockell Ventrich. Frowning and wary, he was sure that he had heard the story about being kicked out of the British Academy because of trouble with his cousin. After hearing this information, Ligon let out a long sigh of relief and felt that his situation was better than in the next class. Next, we are transported to Kim. Erin followed him and looked straight into his eyes. Without turning around, he asked what was going on. She very timidly, but at the same time boldly, directly in front of him, screamed about the request to teach her how to use a sword after the show at the Trolls. Kim stood with his briefcase, not understanding what she meant. Aaron looked at him and said that the ball handling skills he had once demonstrated, she would like him to teach her the same. Kim closed his eyes and started picking at his ear. He said they would teach her this technique. Aaron looked at him and asked why he wouldn't teach ya. Kim turned his back to her and asked her why she had asked him to do this, after which he again said that he didn't want to teach her this technique. He looked ahead and asked if there was anything else to say, then turned his head and said they were leaving. Aaron, Stala, and Dima asked him to teach him how to use the ball. Kim was displeased and repeated that he didn't want to do this. He looked in her direction and asked her if she had any hearing problems, after which he told her to stop clinging to them. After which, he pointed his finger at him and said that he had no desire to teach her, so he asked her to fuck off from him. After which, she looked towards Kim, who was walking away into the sunset. Without a trace, we are transported to the next day in Valhalla. Kim was sitting quietly at his desk, and some of the students were also in the classroom. He sat silently and stared ahead, after which he stretched out his hand and thought about how it was expected enough, but his body was much worse than he thought. He looked down at his hand with distaste. He sat and looked at her and realized that training with martial arts or whatever it was, there was nothing he could do because he didn't have any magic power and it was difficult to control his mana. He clenched his fist and realized that the problem with magic power could be solved if he found the thing and prepared some mana inside himself, after which someone interrupted his thoughts. Someone came up to him and called out. Kim looked in the direction of the person and it was a guy with blonde hair and a girl. This was the main Ventrich family, Rockell Ventrich, and the girl who was standing next to him was Rockell Ventrich's maid, Yuri de Felix. Rockell was standing across from Kim, who was looking at him and rocking back and forth in his chair. After that, he asked who he was. I said that I would have expected this from an uneducated person, the way he didn't even know the Ventrich family. Rockell introduced himself and said he would ask him directly. He held out his hand with a malicious smile and asked if he wanted to get stronger. In most families, it is more difficult for the side branches of the family line to gain power and wealth than the main line, the family. There was a main family line and a side line itself. However, the Ventrich family had a mask with a beak that was a scary constellation. They looked quite creepy, which made the Ventrich family different from other families. Usually, the constellation had an S-class or higher guardian who protected the family, and they directly chose a member of the constellation and gave them protection and power, but the Ventrich family decided to fulfill the contract with a non-constellation family member, and this was a way for the chosen person to fulfill the contract with the constellation without disagreement. This unique choice was that the Ventrichs had a lot of power in Europe, and if they were members of the Ventrich family, they could choose a contractor regardless of their background. In this way, a secondary branch of the family could have the same power as the main family line of Rockell Ventrich, who was kept under control by his family. Rockell felt his power and was satisfied with all of this. He became too arrogant, but not long ago, there was a commotion with the British Academy. Rockell was shocked by this and eventually they kicked him out and he couldn't go there anymore. Rockell looked at it all and thought that it was alright and it wasn't over yet. Then someone started walking towards him, and he turned his head. He looked at Felix and said with a smile that he always got what he wanted, despite the fact that he was kicked out before. He looked forward with a smile and understood that he was from the Ventrich family, and they always had a way to get him back on his right path, and this person liked B. After that, he would imagine the dark silhouette of an unknown person with a smile. Rockell closed his eyes and smiled, because first he had to think about the main thing. Rockell held out his hand towards Kim with a smile, and he realized that he needed to draw Kim, who was the center of attention, to his side. Rockell looked in his direction with a smile and said that if Kim obeyed him, he would take him to the Ventrich family constellation. Yuria, on the other hand, was standing in the back, silently looking away. Kim looked at him and asked if he was an idiot. Rockell was shocked by this answer. He was angry and Yuria was wary. Rockell looked at him and said something again. Kim looked at him again and asked if he thought he was stupid. Kim told Tom that he knew perfectly well that he wasn't interested in him, so he decided to just start showing off from the beginning, and now that he was talking such nonsense, he really was an idiot, Kim said. Rickdillow's expression changed, and he started to get very angry and gritted his teeth. He said Kim was just a dirty brat. After which, they were both hailed from behind by someone. The man told Rockell to return to his seat. Rockell hesitated and turned to the side, shouting. He asked me how you could even say his full name boldly. He turned to the side and saw Lee standing in the classroom, watching him sternly with his hands folded in front of him. He said with a serious face that this wasn't the British Academy, this was Valhalla, and no matter how big his family was, he had to obey the instructors here. Rockell listened to everything he said with a displeased face and wondered if Sanal really was Valhalla's instructor. After which, he hissed in displeasure and turned to the side and started walking forward, while Kim watched the whole thing. Rockell opened the door and turned not quite in Kim's direction and said that they would meet later. Kim looked at him with his confident and piercing gaze. After that, we see Kim and the other students walking out of Valhalla after class. Kim walked forward and thought, today, he didn't learn anything new, and he didn't learn anything related to the Constellation room. Instead, he got involved with some idiot this morning. Kim rested his hands on his head and realized that she now knew that the guild guides were a bunch of outsiders who came to the school. So they used students and instructors to keep an eye on him. At the same time, Aaron was quietly following him. Kim wondered if it wasn't bad enough for him to speak ill of them. Then Aaron called out to him. Kim turned to the side and saw Aaron standing in front of him and asking him to teach her how to play the ball again. Kim looked at her with a displeased face and asked was it not enough for her last time too. Next up, we see Valhalla's dorm in a high-class room. It was very luxurious and everything was fine inside. Immediately, we see someone banging their fist on the lamp and cursing. It was Rockell and Yuri. Rockell Stola was very displeased. He looked in the direction of the broken vase and started to get angry thinking about Kim being a pathetic orphan. Rockell couldn't believe how the man was laughing at him to humiliate him in front of everyone. He called out to Yuri and told her to call Desir as he had someone to deal with. Standing in the room and smashing everything in a row, Rockell wanted to harm anyone who approached him now. Glancing back at Yuri, he called out to her and received only her lowered gaze to the floor in silence. He grabbed her by a bundle of stripes and demanded an explanation, but she only wheezed in pain. Rockell leaned over and said, "Do you really still think you're the eldest daughter of a palace family?" Yuri was completely terrified and shrouded in fear. She heard his screams and could not believe that he was saying such a thing to her. He kept shouting at her, asking if he should expel her from the family. After all this time, she dared to protest, but he only pushed her with all his strength, and she landed on the floor in pain. After giving her his evil look, he ordered her to contact Desir and noted that there was someone who needed to be taken care of. Yuri continued to sit on the floor while instructions were given to her, adding that the son of the Rise family was in the 2nd grade and he should have been told that Rockell himself wanted to see him. She humbly listened to the instructions and accepted them. Meanwhile, in the Valhalla dorm, while in Kim Joo-hyuk's room, he began to concentrate and gather internal mana within himself. With his hands folded between them, he meditated deeply and was lost in his thoughts, emitting a blue aura around him and bits of his mana flying around the room. After finishing his meditation, Kim let out a deep breath and honestly felt heavy. Then he said that his body is garbage because it is very weak and he can't use mana. Kim was sitting on the edge of his bed in frustration. After that, we flash outside and Kim was walking home, followed by Aaron. Kim's face was displeased, then suddenly stopped and Aaron became alert. Kim turned to her and looked at her. Why the hell did she keep following him? They were already outside the dorm and Kim asked how long she was going to take. Aaron looked at him and told him to teach her the art of ball possession. Kim looked at her and asked if she wasn't a parrot by chance as he kept repeating the same thing. Kim looked at her and thought in his head that she was too annoying and he had to get rid of her. After which, he named the amount of 10 million won. Aaron was surprised and Kim said that this amount is the cost of one lesson, after which he asked if it was affordable. Aaron looked down thoughtfully. After that, Kim was going to go to this class, but Aaron calmly asked for his phone number. Kim didn't understand why I was doing this. Then he handed her his phone and asked her why she needed it. She picked up the phone and said that she would write down her phone number to him. After that, she, holding her phone in her hand, gave him his phone and said that it would be much easier and easier for her to send him money. Kim picked up the phone in surprise and was shocked when he looked at his phone and saw a transfer of 100 million won. Aaron held the phone to her face and asked if he would teach her. After that, he smiled and laughingly said that he would not teach her and canceled the transfer. Kim was in his apartment and was very surprised that a female student would send him 100 million won. He closed one eye and began to think. He realized that if he was going to teach her, he wouldn't have to give up his secrets, and it was quite a huge amount of money even if it didn't matter. Kim got up from his bed and realized that it was only money anyway. He needed to find it first, even if he had very little mana. After which, he started putting on his clothes. He put on his sneakers and I stood up. He took his tools with him and put on a hood and said that it was necessary to find a secret vault. There was a huge Valhalla building on the street and a huge stadium nearby. Kim walked through the forest between the trees. As he walked forward, he thought about how before he entered this academy, he had checked it in advance and most of the notes that were hidden 300 years ago had long since been destroyed. According to research, at least 4 notes could be found there. Kim continued to walk forward, picking up rocks. Kim knew that it was more than likely that there were only 3 notes left, and they were probably somewhere in the mountains of Valhalla. Kim stood in front of the academy and looked far up at the mountain. He took off his hood and knew he had to find them. After that, he began to concentrate, stretching his arms forward and the ground began to shine blue. Kim began to release his mana and concentrate with his eyes closed. He knew that he could find them because they were responding to his mana, and that was why he was doing it now. Kim could sense the notes with what little mana he had right now. Then, in the clearing, he smelled the bright light of mana. He opened his eyes and realized what he had found. He walked over to this place that was emitting blue mana and started digging there. As soon as he dug through, he was already confused and told me that his body was so damn weak, and if he had known it would be so difficult, he would have buried it in a safer place. He dug a small hole and said that if the Tower of Destruction hadn't appeared, it wouldn't be time to do it now. When the world was on the verge of destruction and there was no room for its riches, so I made notes to fit everything here. He hoped the contents inside were safe. Then the sun began to rise. Kim dug a huge hole with shortness of breath, said that he found their notes that he buried in a previous life. He stood in the pit and saw the safe that was buried. Kim crouched down and searched for the keyhole. He found it and realized that a normal key would not fit in this keyhole, after which he stretched out his hands in front of him and began to concentrate the remaining mana into a sphere. Kim was going to make a magic thread. After that, he made a likeness of the keys out of it. Then he would put it in the safe, and Kim was glad that the key went in there. He opened the safe and the sun began to shine in. He jumped in and Kim looked ahead happily. There was an incalculable amount of riches and various precious stones. Kim watched it all with her hands folded on her waist and asked if all was well with his children. He looked at these riches and said that now that he didn't have to worry about money left to find the notes. After which, he was surprised and looked ahead. He saw that there were dark purple storage stones lying ahead. He bent down to pick it up and said to save the notes he had put a lot of magic into them, but the day had come when he would had to. After that, he took the stone in his hand and the stone began to emit a lot of mana energy. Kim immediately replenished all of his mana and realized with a smile that he expected nothing less from the storage stones. He immediately felt his power overflowing. After holding the stone in his hand replenished all of his mana, he put his hand in his pocket and said that he should first take care of the remaining storage to me. Kim pondered whether he should leave the heavy gold bars and take the light jewelry. After that, we are transferred to the Valhalla Academy. Kim sat in his chair as if he'd been killed. Kim was looking up, and with a completely tired look, he said that he didn't even think that he would use notes in the future and he must be a crazy fool since his muscles are aching terribly from just digging the ground a little. After which, his thoughts were distracted by Aaron, who squatted down to his party and looked at him. Kim saw this and holding onto his shoulder, he asked what she was doing. Aaron looked at him and asked him to teach him swordsmanship again. Kim, holding onto her shoulder, said that she really wouldn't rest until she did. He looked at her and thought, according to the information he found when he was reborn among the top 5 families, the Choyjin family, which includes Choy Aaron, is a family that practices swordsmanship. Kim didn't understand why exactly he had to do this, so she asked her directly. Kim said she could easily learn about her family. She looked at him and said that she didn't want to learn from them, and she wanted to learn it from him. She said that she had never seen anyone better with a sword than him. Kim asked about Aaron's father, who was a hero of Choyjin. Kim told her that he was a better swordsman than him. Aaron inquiringly said father. After that, Ligon immediately came into the office and distracted their dialogue. He told Kim to follow him to the staff room. Aaron stood up to her full height and Kim asked why she had to go to the staff room. Ligon looked and said that it was about what he asked last time. He asked if he was interested. Kim then stood up with a smile on his face and said that he was on his way. He started walking around the office, and Aaron held out her hand to call out to him, then looked down and Kim told her to come to the training ground at 6 a.m. Aaron looked at Kim, who was about to go to the staff room, before he turned around and asked if there was any problem. Aaron started waving her head happily. She looked ahead and said something that would definitely come. Kim came to the staff room and stood in front of Ligon, who was sitting there looking at him. He said he had a class coming up so he would talk fast. Ligon said that first of all, Kim's access to Constellation's room was approved. Ligon told him that it was just enough to go down to the ground floor. Kim was surprised once said about the basement. Ligon said that he was not allowed to go to any other floor than the basement. Kim smiled and said he understood, then asked when he could get there. Ligon said that if he didn't have anything to do, then tonight he would be able to. Kim said with a smile that he would go there today. Ligon sat with a serious face and began to think. He said it was unexpected and he thought Kim was making a fuss because he wasn't allowed on the second floor. After which, he said that they would go there today. Kim said he understood, then turned and headed for the exit. It was already evening outside, and Ligon was with Kim. Ligon looked ahead and said they weren't there yet. Ahead of them, there was a huge building where guards were stationed and everything was sealed with a red chain with a seal. Ligon said that it was the treasures of Valhalla Academy, the Constellation room. Kim immediately started looking around the place and glanced to the side. He saw the guards, so he looked in the other direction and saw the guards too. Kim put his hand to his head and told Ligon that there were more guards here than at the main gate. Ligon looked ahead and said that it showed how important the Constellation room was, as it made Valhalla one of the Academy's 3 great ones. Kim looked ahead and began to think. He understood that not only were there numerous guards, but the outer wall they were all covered in all sorts of magic, and it was completely surrounded except for the entrance. The walls were completely sealed with various seals and chains. Kim asked if he could ask a question. Ligon looked at him and asked what had happened. Kim asked how it was possible to get to the 2nd floor. If he got there, it would be considered a crime. Ligon looked at him with his hands folded in front of him and said that he didn't have to be a criminal, but he would definitely be expelled from the academy, and besides, he would go mad even before he was expelled. Kim asked what Ligon meant by going crazy. Ligon said that on the 2nd floor, the magic power was restless, and if he touched this magic that was there, then his mind would collapse and he would just go crazy. Kim once again repeated that he was going to go crazy and said with a smile that he understood everything. Ligon became alert and began to think. He wondered why this brat was asking him this right in front of the entrance. Ligon assumed that Tut really wanted to get there, after which he realized that this was not the case and the candidate for the first place would not do it. Ligon was standing behind Kim when the gate opened, and Ligon was quite sure that Kim knew perfectly well that he should have stayed at the academy. Ligon looked ahead and shouted at him that he had 30 minutes to get out of there. The guard opened the door for Kim, who turned around and said that he would be back soon. After which, the system panel wrote for him to return his weapons and memories to the 3rd floor of the 5th room to the right of Valhalla. Kim stood and stared at the message. He said that he would still be expelled and he came to Valhalla in the first queue for this, and first he needed to get to the 3rd floor. Kim started down the stairs and there were gears and pipes on the walls. Kim wondered why there were so many stairs and he couldn't see the end. Kim looked up and didn't know where he was. He assumed that it was a prison, but he looked away and said that he was sure that the Constellation room was on the 2nd floor, but it was probably here. Kim started walking forward and said that it wasn't really important anyway, but then he thought about whether we should go any further. After that, he became alert and the system panel came out in front. It said that all the conditions had been met and that he would now be moved to another room. Kim looked at all this and didn't understand what room it was about, after which it slowly began to dissipate. An unknown voice said that it had been a long time for Kim Hyunho. Kim became alert and looked ahead. He saw in front of him a man who was dressed in a beautiful uniform, and over his eyes was a blindfold and had horns. Kim said to Barch questioningly. Barch said with a smile that 300 years had passed, then asked if it was a reunion. Barch didn't have time to finish even after that, and a blow immediately flew at him. Kim angrily slapped him across the face and angrily told him that he was very happy to see the fool here. Barch, with a bruise on his face, stretched out his hands and told Kim to wait, but immediately another one hit flew through Barch and Kim told him to die. Barch held out his hands again and told them to calm down and talk among themselves. Kim, not listening to him, struck again and told him to just die. Barch asked him to stop, but Kim kept hitting him and hitting him. Kim said they wouldn't stop and would hit him even harder. After a lot of punches, Kim stood and stared at Barch, who would completely hit the batters. Kim closed his eyes and began to breathe calmly. He said that he was not one of those people who used his fists. Barch looked at him blankly and then he started kicking him. Kim angrily hit him and said that it was different in this case because Barch had ruined his comfortable future. He beat his feet, said his wealth and honor, and all the while he was training his students. Barch asked him to stop, then asked if he was interested in what kind of place they were in. Kim looked at it and asked what kind of place it was, since there was nothing there. Barch started to get to his feet and said it was an imaginary world. Kim asked what kind of imaginary world he was talking about. Barch started to correct his form and said that to be exact it was a space in the relic, and the one from which Kim was now seeing was just an incarnation in an imaginary world, and his real body had already ceased to exist 300 years ago. Kim stood up in surprise or listened to everything he said. Kim asked him to wait for him and asked if he was always in this relic. Barch said that was exactly what happened. After that, Kim realized everything. Barch stretched out his arms and a light yellow seal appeared behind him. He said that he understood everything correctly and he became a constellation. Kim just stared ahead at the happy Barch. Kim got even angrier and asked what was going on here in the first place, then started punching him in the face again. On the street at this time, Ligong was standing looking ahead, where there were many guards. Ligong stared ahead in silence, after which he looked surprised and Kim walked out of the building, and the guards began to inspect him. Kim walked over to Ligon, and then they didn't do anything strange to you. Kim held out his hand and said that he just looked around and couldn't go any further, as he would go crazy if he did. Ligon looked thoughtfully at all this and said that he understood and then told him to go home. Kim said that he would, then turned and walked forward. He walked down the street and thought about what had happened there. Kim pointed his finger forward and said that he didn't care about Barch becoming a constellation, then told him to just answer his question. Kim asked if he had created a transparent system notification bar, then asked what it was. The beaten Barch looked at him and said that he didn't know anything, whereupon Kim viciously took him by the farm and picked him up and was about to beat him again. Kim said Barch was a fool. Barch said he was telling the absolute truth. Barch said that after Kim killed him, he was inside this thing for 300 years without any energy. Kim thought for a moment, then dismissed Barch. Kim asked who then created the notification. Barch looked down and said that he had also received this notification. He said that he had received a notification that he could contact the reincarnated Kim Hayek and get all his memories back. Kim listened to everything he said and asked about reincarnations. Barch looked ahead and said that that was when that suspicious person appeared and most likely made him the owner of the tower and destruction. Kim asked who was the person who made Barch to the owners of the tower. Barch held out his hand and said that he didn't know that, because all his memory of that part had simply disappeared. Barch said he didn't think the vanished memories came back right away. He looked ahead and asked Kim what was in his mind. Kim put her hand to her chin and said that she asked him to find a weapon, and he couldn't calculate what was below because it was censored by squares. Kim spread his arms out to the sides and said that he didn't remember losing any memories and he also still has memories of that tower. Barch pointed his index finger forward and said that maybe Kim remembered all the memories and he had already found the weapon, so the memories would appear naturally. Kim looked at him in surprise and asked if he had actually found the same weapon. Barch said that it was just like that, and this space is the inner world of the 4 weapons of the village balls that became sacred relics. They were very powerful and radiated a huge amount of mana. Barch said that he became a constellation because he used the village sword as a relic. Kim was getting angry and was already clenching his fists to beat him up again. Barch asked what was wrong with that. Kim started shouting loudly and viciously and said that Barch was a complete fool. Kim walked down the street and thought about his village sword. His village sword became a relic and inside it was a constellation. He didn't understand what kind of situation it was at all. Kim held out his hand and knew that of course he wanted to just destroy it and forget it, but no matter how worn it was, he was holding back Barch, who was once called the King of Destruction. After which, a blue village sword appeared in his hand. Kim held it in his hands and said that there was nothing he could do about the quest that appeared in the notification window, which was only available with the village sword. Kim said that he didn't know anything for him, after which someone called out to him and Kim looked away. An unknown voice said that Kim won first place in the entrance ceremonies. In front of Kim was a crowd of people with different hairstyles who were flexing their fists. A guy with yellow hair said that his scary friends were on a trip. This was Valhalla Academy's second-year student, the eldest son of the Sunrise family, Lyric Sunrise. Kim looked at him and asked if he was really the eldest, and then I asked a bully like him if there were any juniors as well. A guy started walking forward and stretching his arms. The lyricist said that Kim was too fearless, after which he said that if he took first place in the first year, it wasn't enough to just go over and say hello to the seniors. Some guy with a gun came out of the crowd and said he was going to beat this fool. The lyricist said that the bomb would go easy on him. The guy with the gun called out to the newcomer and told him about the difference between first and second years. But before he could finish, he was immediately kicked in the body. Kim looked at them with a smile on her face and told them to stop talking and attack him all at once. After he hit the guy, he immediately jumped up and started swinging 2 legs and hit him right in the face. Kim landed on the ground and after being hit so hard, he immediately flew far away into the crowd. The other guys dispersed and watched as his body fell to the ground. They watched as he slammed into the wall. The lyricist turned to the side with a vicious face and said that he was a crazy fool. He saw Kim pick up the sword. The lyricist was surprised, as he was completely sure that he didn't have any sword originally. Kim grasped the sword, said it was a very pleasant feeling of a perfect grip. I told him that I hadn't seen my balls in a while, and then he held out his hand in front of him and said with a malicious smile that you should be attacked faster. Kim was quite sure that it would be a lot of fun and if he didn't stay put, he would smear their heads all over. After that, we flash back 3 hours and see the lyricist standing in the room and talking to some guy. This guy said with a smile that the lyricist would need to do one simple thing. That guy was Rockell, and Uriah was standing quietly behind him. Rockell was sitting on the couch and said that he would just need to take care of one student. Rockell and Lyric were sitting on couches opposite each other. Rockell said that he would definitely reward Lyric for helping the Sunrise family. Rockell said that one freshman student Kim was his target and Lyric needed to take care of him. The lyricist sat back in front of him and listened to everything Rockell said. He said that it didn't matter if he used a gun or not, he needed him to clean up the mess. Rockell looked at him with her evil gaze with a smile and asked if he agreed or not. The lyricist looked at him calmly and said that he understood everything, then he went out the door, closed it. He looked ahead and began to ponder. The lyricist realized that it didn't matter to him that Kim was ranked #1 among the rookies, how he couldn't be a match for the seniors, and the rookies and seniors were very different from each other due to their contact with Constellation. Valhalla students had to go to the Constellation room in the second semester of the first year and make a contract with one of the constellations. Students who signed a contract became contracts. Lyric went ahead and with a confident face understood that when they became a contractor, they could use the power of their constellation, and that freshman who wasn't born in the special, I didn't even have a guardian constellation. Lyric looked ahead with a malicious look and a smile and swiped that he could easily defeat Kim. The lyricist thought so until the moment he met him in real life. Kim swung his sword and hit one guy on the leg, and a blinding monolight was released from the impact. Another guy with red hair picked up his knife and said Kim was a fool and started walking towards him. But right then, Kim started swinging his sword and was about to hit him in the face. The guys with the red hair didn't even notice when he swung and Kim hit him in the face, sending him flying. Kim looked with his confident gaze to the right and saw one of the guys pick up a weapon and jump on top of him to attack. He swung his weapon and angrily shouted for Kim to die. After that, a strong impact was heard and damaged the ground, but Kim was not in place. The guy looked sideways and realized that his attack had missed. At this time, Kim was standing on the other side and was about to hit that guy with his sword. He ironically asked the guy what he had missed. After that, there was a strong blow to the face, and the guy flew into the crowd. Lyric watched all this and watched as another guy fell to the ground. The lyricist was shocked by everything that was happening. He couldn't believe that freshmen were being forgotten by sophomores one by one. He looked at all the guys he had defeated and realized that before becoming a contractor, the sophomores had to have higher skills in martial arts or magic than the freshmen, but they weren't all helpless against Kim. But he turned his head in Kim's direction and wondered what that strange swordsmanship was. Kim walked slowly forward, brandishing his sword. Lyric watched it all and realized something wasn't even putting in the effort. The people around him were getting seriously hit and injured. Kim looked to the side and noticed a couple of other guys. He called out and said what he told them, that he would smear their heads if they just stood there. The boys hesitated and began to slowly back away. The lyricist noticed this and realized that everyone was trying to decide whether to attack him or run. After which, he viciously shouted at them not to attack and not to stand still. After all, this was just a pathetic freshman. Kim smiled and realized that the hooligan boss had some spirit. Lyric told him to shut up and picked up his sword. He was about to swing his sword and attack him, but immediately Kim got close to him and presented his sword to Lyric's stomach. Kim said with a hard look and a smile that he had warned them not to stand still. After which, he pushed the sword with his other hand, and the impact force of the sword went right through Lyric. Lyric started coughing up blood of such intensity and didn't understand how he could get so close to him. Then he fell to the floor. Kim raised his hand and started slapping his face while crouching down. Kim told him to wake up, then asked him who he was and why he had attacked him. The lyricist woke up and looked at him, said they were sophomores. Kim was squatting down and talking to Lyric, who was lying on the ground, and there were a lot of battered guys around. Kim Popo realized that it was a group of upperclassmen and they came to knock down a freshman. He asked why they did it. Kim told the lyricist to name the person who told him to do it. The lyricist looked down and said that it was done in order to break the nose of the freshman ranked one, and that's it. Kim smiled and asked if it was really accepted from the hooligans. Then he said that he was surprised. Kim took his bag and said he was going, and then he told them to clean up the place. Lyricist, lying on the ground, called out to him and told him to wait. He started to get up and asked once if he would be able to go to the academy normally after that. The lyricist said that it doesn't matter if he took first place in the first year. The lyricist said that people will find out about this incident and he will be expelled from the academy. Kim looked at him and said, picking his nose, that it didn't matter to him. Kim looked at him and asked if Toot wanted to tell him the story of the fight. The lyricist was very annoyed by this. Kim said that several sophomores came to shoot down one freshman, but they did not succeed. Kim said that if the whole story came out, they would be very ashamed to go to the academy. After that, he looked at them with a malicious smile and pointed a finger at them and said that they would do very wisely if they want to graduate from the academy and join the guild. After which, Kim turned around and walked forward while Lyric lay on the ground and trembled from the damage. At the same time, Rockell was sitting on the couch looking at his phone. He watched with a smile and knew that the phone was going to ring soon. A minute later, Lyric Sunrise calls him. Rockell picks up the phone and calls out to the older man with a smile. He asked if he beat up Kim Joo-hyuk. The lyricist called out to Rockell in desperation and told him that he was giving up the job. Rockell was shocked when he heard this from the lyricist on the phone call. Rockell was sitting on the couch and asked what the lyricist was talking about. The beat-up lyricist Po told him to stay away from anything related to Kim Joo-hyuk. Rockell was sitting in shock. He didn't understand why things had turned out this way, but the last time they talked, the lyricist seemed very confident. After that, the lyricist said that this was all and he hung up. Rockell told him to wait and tell him if he was saying this because Kim Joo-hyuk beat him up, he can report it to the administration. The lyricist listened to everything he said in silence. Rockell calmly said that if he had any visible injuries, it meant that they had enough evidence to be believed. Rockell said to let Lyric do at least that. Rockell said that if he just did it, he would give him the full amount, as promised, and he would try to make sure that his family could finance it. Lyric said that even if the Ventrich family agreed to finance them, they couldn't reclaim the honor since they lost. Rockell was shocked at that. Lyric along with his beat-up guys started to slowly walk forward. The lyricist said he was hanging up. Rockell tried to call out to him, but it was too late. After that, he angrily threw his phone on the ground, thereby breaking it. Rockell said the lyricist was a complete fool. Rockell was sitting with his head down, and Yuria was standing next to him, looking at all this. Rockell covered his face with his hands and called out to Yuria. Rockell asked if she had contacted Desir. Yuria said that she informed him that he wanted to meet him in person, but since he was far away, it would take him some time to get here. Rockell glared at her and asked where the hell he was. After that, we see a huge beautiful building in Mexico. It was the Aripia Academy. There was a mountain of corpses in the building. The man was sitting on a mountain of corpses and in holding his phone, he was surprised that Rockell wanted him to come to Korea. This guy was Desir Ventrich. He had scars on his face and was well groomed. He handed over the phone and read the message from Rockell. Come quickly to take care of a man named Kim Joo-hyuk, Rockell said in a message. The reward was already prepared, Rockell wrote, and after that, Desir's face changed and started to smile very broadly. He stared at his phone like a madman and started thinking. There was no one he could ask for money after he was kicked out. He said it was easy. A remarkable turn of events came the next day in the training room, which was packed with exercise tools when Kim arrived. He stood with his bag and was very surprised that the training hall was very large. He had assumed that it was so vast and because the academy was also big. He looked ahead and said that he really wanted to go for a run. After that, a certain voice was heard and he asked why Kim was here. Kim was very surprised and wary of this. He started to turn his head and asked if it was Barch. Kim didn't understand how or from where he could talk to him. Barch said that he was currently in a sword that was sealed. Barch asked him why he was so surprised. Kim said that he was very surprised because he thought that he had somehow made it to the surface, because then he would have to beat him up again and drag him into the sword again. Barch was startled when he heard this, but he didn't show it. What Barch said was that there was no such thing, so he wouldn't have to worry about anything. Kim changed into his gym uniform and opened the locker to put his stuff in and said that if that was the case, it was fine. Kim put his foot to the side and started to warm up. He asked Barch if everything was really alright. Barch did not specify whether it was about his condition. Kim put his hands behind his head and said that he was talking about a sword that had become an artifact and was currently kept in Valhalla. Kim said that they left the room and Constellation was with him. Barch said that there was no need to worry about it, as he had replaced the sword with an exact replica. Kim said that was what he was worried about. Kim asked Barch where he had learned how to create an exact replica of objects in the first place. Barch sat back and said that when he regained consciousness, he lost all his powers, but he could create an exact replica, although he doesn't know why he even had this ability. Kim continued to warm up and said something that Barch generally didn't know much about. When Kim tilted his body back, he saw Awen standing in front of him. Kim finished his warm-up routine and realized that she had arrived. Awen asked if Kim was going to teach her how to play the ball right now. Kim looked at her and said they were going. He said they would start by increasing her stamina. Awen turned her head and asked why. Kim turned around and said that she could have left at any time if she didn't want to. Awen looked at him and said that she would do it. Kim turned to her with a smile and told her to start stretching. Kim said that the higher her stamina, the better she would be able to absorb mana and easily control it in battle, and even though it was a basic improvement in swordsmanship, it was still necessary. Awen started to warm up and stretch. Kim was surprised by their training methods, as they were putting everything in Oni mana into their stamina for some reason. Kim thought about how even Choy Awen was like this, even though she had a lot of mana, but her stamina was like a beginner who was just starting to wield a sword. Awen finished stretching and warming up and said she was ready. Kim looked at her and said that then they would start a real training session. Kim started doing intense exercises. Kim started doing push-ups. Awen started to repeat after him, but it was also very difficult. Kim started doing squats with weights, and Awen was tired enough even without weights. Kim started doing deadlifts, and Awen took dumbbells. After training, she fell to the floor and was very tired. Her face was flushed and I was sweating. Kim turned to the side and waved his hand, saying that they were just getting started. Awen asked him what he had just said. Kim looked at her and told her to stop lying down and get up as soon as possible. It was still necessary to run about 20 kilometers. Awen, I heard you were in shock. Next, we are transported to the classroom. Kim was sitting on a chair, stretching his arm. He asked her if she was feeling alright, because even though they put in more effort than last time, she did pretty well and started to develop her physique. Awen sat silently on a chair and was very tired. The teacher stood in front of the class and told everyone to be quiet. The teachers said they would have a simple written test today. The teacher's name was Lilia, and she wore glasses and had a short white haircut. This was Valhalla's highest level instructor and her head of the spatial monster item. The students sat at their desks and listened intently to the teacher. Lilia said what she had briefly explained in day 1, but advised them to study spatial monsters a bit on their own. She put the paper tests on the desk and said that today she would test them on how well they knew how to deal with each individual type of monster. Soyan started to solve the test. Senyuk sat and pondered over it. Aaron sat up tired and her body was shaking. Kim sat at his desk and didn't even touch the test, he just stared at it. Lilia looked at the clock and said that the time was up and let the students from the end pass the tests forward. She said that today's test will not be added to their overall score, but it will be used to assess their ability for the next class. Kim was passing the test to Aaron. Lilia corrected all the tests and said that in the next class they will start officially a lesson in the room and simulation of virtual fighters. She opened the door and said she wouldn't see you again, then left. Kim stared ahead in silence, and then Barch suddenly started talking to him. Barch asked if he was really sure that he had written his answers correctly. Kim realized that he, too, had seen everything. Barch folded his hands and said he saw it because he was inside and had nothing to do. Kim asked if he had read his mind. Barch said that to be precise, he could only hear what Kim was thinking. Kim sat on a chair and asked seriously. Kim rocked back and forth in his chair and said that he only wrote the answers as he knew them. Barch said that if this is the case, then he raises it. Lilia came to the first-year teacher's office and sat down at her seat. Lilia gritted her teeth in anger. She took Kim's job and didn't understand how he could dare call this nonsense answers. After that, we are transported to Ligon. He was holding a hot drink as he headed forward. He looked away and thought about it. He saw Lilia in front of him, who was diligently checking the students' tests. Ligon looked in her direction and asked if it was his class of work. Lilia looked at him and said yes. She looked at the papers and said that while preparing for the mock battle, she told them to learn how to kill monsters, so she gave him a simple written test, but as she expected in a class where children from famous families study, they all succeeded. Ligon was a little nervous and asked if that was really the case. After that, he looked in her direction holding a mug with a drink and said that he would not disturb her and would go about his business. He took a sip from his mug and then choked on it. He heard the teacher say Kim's name loudly. Ligon wiped his mouth, and he and the other workers heard Lilia's displeasure. She didn't understand how he read those answers correctly. Ligon looked in her direction and asked did Kim do so badly. She looked in his direction and said that it wasn't just bad, he was bullying the class while writing the test. Ligon asked again if it was really that bad. Lilia, holding the test, said that it was impossible to just leave it and at the next lesson she would show Kim his work and carefully instruct him that monsters are not easy to deal with. After that, Nod entered his test. A day later, the students stood and watched Lilia explain the rules to the students. It was a simulation of a virtual battle. Lilia looked ahead and said that she had checked and brought back the tests that the students had written in the last class. She said that most of the students did very well, but then she called out to Kim. Kim stood picking at his ear. He walked over to the teacher and looked ahead. Lilia held the test out in front of him and told him to take it. Kim was surprised, and when he took his test he saw that there was a 0 score. Lilia looked ahead and said that Kim gets 0 points, then she asked if he was sure that he wrote the test correctly. Kim looked at him and said with a confident face that he had indeed written the test correctly. After that, Lilia counted one question. How best to deal with stone goblins? Lilia asked him how he answered that question. Kim looked at his test and said to stab him in the stomach with a sword. Lilia silently began to beat her forehead with her fist. Lilia has read 2 questions. You will find that 8 stone goblins are approaching you. Think about what you should do in this situation. The other students were nervous and watched Kim read the book. Kim answered this question like this, starting with those who throw themselves at themselves, and you stab each of them and send them to hell. Lilia turned her head and said that he couldn't be serious. She said that even if Kim acted like he had learned a bit of strategy, she was going to leave it at that. She looked at the students and asked if the best way to kill a stone goblin was to stab it in the stomach. After that, she immediately said that the stone goblin's defense was at level B+, which meant that normally the sword's aura wouldn't harm it at all, but Kim wanted to say that using a sword against this type of monster. Kim started picking his ear and said that's exactly what he would do and it would end with one punch. Lilia started to get very angry and started thinking to herself that even Kim's ego knew no bounds, and he was talking complete nonsense. After that, she said that she completely understood him. Kim was surprised by this. The teacher told him that since the student Kim was sure of his answer, she would give him the opportunity to demonstrate everything, and then press the button that was at the bottom. After that, everything started to shake and stone goblins started to appear, snarling and drooling. They stood behind the teacher and looked in Kim's direction. Lilia looked ahead with a smile and said that if he hits monsters the same way he wrote in his answer, then she will recalculate his points. Kim put his hand behind his head and said that he understood everything. He asked for permission to put the test back in its place and held out his hand with the test in the direction of the teacher. He picked up the sword that was lying nearby, then slowly walked towards the stone goblin with his hand in his pocket. He walked over to the goblin who was looking at him with red eyes. Lilia watched all this and pondered. She had heard that Kim had killed all 120 summoned goblins, and she was sure that he had talent, but at least with the stone goblins, they couldn't handle any random sword. Kim held the sword, and then the stone goblin charged. Kim started swinging his sword, and then there was a blow. Lilia stood there in shock. She didn't understand what had happened. The stone goblin stood there in shock, its body shaking, and it had a sword in its stomach. The goblin's face started to crack, after which it started to disappear. Kim held his hand out and the other students watched. Lilia, along with the other students, were shocked. Kim turned in her direction and said that he would just punch her in the stomach. Soyan was shocked that Kim killed a stone goblin with a normal sword and even without magic. Seniuk stood silently and watched all this. Aaron stood and watched it all with a smile. Lilia didn't believe everything she saw. Kim replaced the gun, and Lilia asked him how he did it. Kim stood up and asked didn't she see how to do it. He just stuck him in the stomach, that's all. Lilia clenched her fist and said that wasn't what she meant. Lilia stood there in shock and bit her finger. She started to think about all this and realized that if he wanted to kill the stone goblin with just ordinary weapons, then he would have to be at least in a class contractor. So it makes sense that he could handle it, but he handled it with a normal sword. Kim put the sword on his shoulders and asked with a smile what was his answer. Lilia said that it was only one question, then said the next one and pressed the key. The ground began to shake and Kim looked and asked again. The ground beneath his feet began to change and a cave appeared in front of him. He pointed at it and asked the teacher what it was. Lilia looked at this and asked if he shouldn't have been more careful. Then she asked me to look in front of her. In front of him was a goblin, and behind him were many more goblins who were holding a bat in their hands and glaring viciously at Kim. Lilia folded her hands in front of her and began to ponder. She understood that the goblins' problem was with control and anger, and it was quite difficult to deal with them. But if they didn't do it properly, then the goblin in front would use the howl skill and all the other goblins in the area would also come out. She knew that people usually fought them with magic and killed them all at once, or just ran away instead of facing him. The man only saw 3 goblins growling and drooling, 5 goblins rushing at him as soon as he made a mistake, and even if he is good with his sword, it will be very difficult to do all this. From what the teacher had heard, his speed with swordsmanship was quite slow. Kim shifted his sword to his other hand and swung it to kill the goblin with a smile on his face. He stabbed the goblin's head right through. The other goblin looked at it and was scared. He decided to use his skills and was about to shout, but then Kim went straight into the man's mouth and stabbed him. He stood calmly and held his sword, which he had just used to stab the goblin through. Lilia stood there in shock and watched it all. Kim turned around with a smile on his face while holding the sword and asked, "Did you answer the second question correctly?" After that, we are transported to the gyms and see Kim running on the treadmill with Aaron, but she looks very tired. On the screen of the treadmill, it says how much she should run, after which she fell to the floor and Kim calmly walked forward. Aaron fell to the floor and tried to catch her breath. Kim silently looked in her direction and asked didn't she train in her clan. Then he asked why and where it was difficult to perform exercises of this level. She looked at him and said that she didn't usually strain herself so much. Kim looked at her and asked her how she trained back then, and if she was going to face the monsters. Aaron held out a finger in front of her and said that she could just use her magic power by borrowing her constellations. Kim looked at her thoughtfully, everything as he expected. He looked at Aaron, who had closed her eyes, and realized that instead of training their stamina, they were focusing on their magic power since they were very dependent on the constellation. And even if they didn't increase their physical abilities, it was normal for them to not train well enough to borrow the constellation's power. However, the risk was too great. Kim had no idea what a group of people would do if they were stuck in the middle of a maze where magic was restricted. He also imagined if a group of people ran out of mana due to the fact that the battle was too long. Kim raised his hand to his chin and wondered if Constellation would lend them the power. He called out to Aaron, so he looked at him. He asked me once if these endurance exercises helped. Aaron stood up and bowed, and she said that they were very helpful. Aaron looked at him and remembered that Kim had told her that she would teach swordsmanship if she did. Kim looked at her with a smile and asked what the answer was. He said she only did it because he told her to do it. Aaron looked at him thoughtfully and Kim said that it didn't matter, after which he turned to the side and suggested that we finish for today since we had to go to the academy soon. Aaron looked at him and asked if he was coming. Kim turned to her side and said that he was going to do one more set. He asked if she wanted to do this to him. Aaron looked up with a tired face. Kim waved his hand and said it didn't matter, then told her to leave. Aaron went to the door and said they would see each other later. Kim silently walked over to the pancakes and started to take them. Barch asked Kim if her name was Choy. Kim asked what was wrong with that. Kim started putting pancakes on the barbell and Barch said that she continued his training without a single complaint. Barch didn't understand why he decided to help her with her training. Kim Sella said that it was only because she pestered him so much to teach her the art of swordsmanship. Barch asked Kim if he had ever shown her his swordsmanship. Kim said he never really showed it off, but she just noticed when he used it during class. Kim closed his eyes and Barch asked if she understood his power. Kim said that he also thought about it and was very interested as he plans to teach her some of his art. After which, he heard someone groaning. He looked to the side and saw Seniuk lifting a barbell. He set her down on the railing and stood up. Seniuk also looked to the side and saw Kim. They sat and looked at each other. Kim asked him how long he had been here. Seniuk dried himself with a towel and then said that he had been here since he was a student. He said that his usual occupation was always to play sports before entering the academy, after which, he placed the towel on his shoulders and stood up. He went ahead and said he had to go. Kim looked at him and pondered. He said that he didn't know because of the fact that he had innate martial qualities, but he was able to train for so long thanks to his talent. He watched Seniuk leave the gym and Barch asked why he was so interested in this man. Kim lay down and said that he was clearly smarter than those who only train their magic power. Moore said it was probably true. Kim grabbed a barbell and asked what the constellations were doing anyway. Barch said he wasn't sure what he meant by that constellation either, but what he did for 300 years was isolate himself here. He said he didn't know anything about the other constellations. Kim took the barbell and Barch said that he could learn more about them if he completed a new constellation in the system. Kim lifted the barbell and thought about the new constellation. Then I took the system message window to the front. Return your weapons and memories. Please return your weapon memories on the 3rd floor 5 room to the right of Valhalla. Task completed. Eye of the Great Forest of Valhalla, home of Maid Guy Rona. Warning, the Heavenly Sword is required to clearly fulfill the conditions. The conditions have been censored. Kim read everything that was on the system panel and said that he had heard about it in class. It was the last place they trained during the first semester. Kim looked ahead and said that if it wasn't for that damned quest, he would have just run away with his stuff, but it looks like he'll have to keep a low profile for a while. Barch asked about covertly because Kim kind of made a big fuss by starting a fight with that bully just recently. Kim said that those upperclassmen came to him on their own and that he had been holding back for a very long time. Barch listened carefully to all this and said that if he didn't, his head would have cracked like Barch's. Kim looked down and said that in any case, until this assignment arrives, he won't be able to leave anytime soon and he hopes it will solve the mystery of his reincarnation. After that, we are transferred to the UK, London. There is a huge building called the Ventrich family mansion. Inside the building, there were mirrors and paintings that had black masks of plague doctors on them. There was a man sitting at the table, and another man was standing across from him. The girl piled many on top of each other and asked them to tell her what had happened. It was Vice President Adelia Ventrich. The man said that the maze on the outskirts of Reading was taken care of. Adelia smiled and said it was a good job, then asked if there was anything else they wanted to tell her. The man said that he would consider hiring a few competent people that he found interesting. He said that in the maze, one of Robert's destroyed clan survived. Adelia said he was strong enough. The man said that this was indeed the case and that the 2 men he found were both rank contractors. Adelia held out her hand in front of her and said that since they were at this level, they deserved a blessing. She said to test their abilities and send them to her. The man said that he understood everything. After Adelia asked if there was anything else. The man said he also had information about Rockell. She asked him what had happened to him again. The man said that he was informed that he had summoned Desir to South Korea. Adelia looked sternly ahead and thought about Desir. After that, we see Desir looking ahead with an evil smile and gaze. He was a problem child in his family. He has done many terrible things using his family name. He smashed up a lot of students and bullied them. At the age of 19, he killed 5 people at an English academy just because they started arguing with him. And at the age of 20, he was exiled with the Ventrich family. Adelia sat and pondered, looking ahead. She knew that Desir had been hiding for many years, and she didn't understand why he was meeting Rockell. Adelia told the man to keep watching Rockell. He bowed and said that everything would be as she wished. He looked up and was surprised when Adelia said if he did something strange, since she was going to expel him from the family. The man bowed and said that he understood and his report was over. After that, he left. Adelia stared ahead and was silent. She began to reflect that all these fools had power that they didn't deserve, and such power wasn't meant for scum. She looked ahead with a stern gaze and said that this power is all for one, everything is only for one person, after all it was all for her. She looked away with a smile and asked if it was true of the painting that had the plague doctor's mask on it. It was the Guardian constellation. Next, we are taken to class, and the teacher says that if they want to define the word villain, then it consists of the words evil and performer, which literally means an evil person. He stood in front of the class and held out his hand. He said that in today's society, the word villain is mostly used to describe people who use the powers of the constellations for evil. The teacher wrote the word villain on the blackboard and said that usually the villain acts alone, but they can create organizations. The teacher was telling her all this, and Kim, in the back of the class, was holding out his hand and looking at her. The teacher said that among these organizations, the most notorious is the One God group. The teacher was talking about the constellation, but Kim thought about it and clenched his hand into a fist. He said that this body, even though it felt like it was getting stronger from simple training, but it also had the talent to use its mana. He looked at his palm and guessed that it might not be a genius level, but it was much better than his body before reincarnation, but it was still very strange for him. He looked at his hand and realized that it didn't matter how untrained this body was, why its condition was so bad. He recalled how he concentrated and gathered all the mana in his body. On day 1, when he was doing this circulation, he was barely able to finish, as he had less mana than a normal person, and when he was digging a hole. His physique was so bad that after just a little searching, he felt like he was losing consciousness. But even with a body like this, it still wasn't enough to turn out so bad. Kim assumed that something had happened to him in the past. He put his hands behind his head and looked ahead. He realized that there was no point in worrying about it right now. Then someone tapped the desk with a finger. Kim looked to the side and saw Soyan turn to look at him. She handed him a note. Kim picked it up and started to unfold it, and the note said hello. Kim was angry when he saw this. He didn't understand why all this was necessary. After that, it was evening outside and they were allowed to leave the academy this weekend. For students who planned to leave, they had to apply, Ligon said. Kim sat at his desk and listened to what Ligong was saying. He said that was all, and Kim was thinking about leaving the academy. He took a walking application that said he wanted to take a walk outside, supported the statement, and went ahead. Barch asked if he really wanted to go outside. Kim said that he was thinking about going somewhere. Barch asked where he planned to go. Then someone called out to Kim. He turned around and saw Soyan standing behind him. He asked her if it was a joke, then asked her what she wanted from him. Soyan stood looking down. Kim said he even kindly responded to her note, but she didn't respond back. He wrote on the note that Kim stood in front of her holding the application and told her to hurry up because he still had to give it to her. Soyan stood up and looked down, awkwardly trying to say something. Kim was shocked with what she couldn't say. Then he got angry and told her to just hurry up and tell her. Then he called her crazy. Soyan looked at him and asked why she wasn't normal. Kim looked at her and asked if she wanted to say something or just make someone angry. Then he asked her what she wanted to tell him. Soyan continued to be confused and remembered the case where Kim could easily take down a stone goblin. She couldn't believe that Kim had easily handled it with just a normal sword and didn't use any magic. She recalled all this and realized that it was different from the books. She looked at him and wanted to know how he killed the stone goblin, but for some reason she had a very bad headache. After that, she wanted to ask him how he killed that goblin, but then teacher Lilia appeared between them and asked if Kim could tell her how he killed that goblin. They stood in silence, looking at each other. Kim was surprised and did not understand where the lily came from. He looked at the teacher who was pointing at herself and asked why she was interrupting the conversation, after which he said that he thought she hated him. Kim looked at the teacher and said that it should be so because he had refuted her questions and she should have hated him for embarrassing her in front of other students. Lilia looked at her with a smile and said that it didn't bother her at all. She said that she believed there was only one way to kill monsters and he showed it to her. She put her hand on his shoulder and asked if he wanted to be her assistant. He looked surprised and said that he would have to refuse because he could be given an application. The teacher went with him holding his hand and asked why she didn't want to. She asked him to become her assistant. Kim said he wouldn't do it, and there was Soyan standing behind them, holding out her hand and trying to call out to them. The teacher said that she would find everything Kim needed. Kim asked her if she was ashamed to do this to me. The teacher asked why she should be embarrassed. Soyan stood and listened to the conversation. Then she closed her eyes and made a fist with a smile and said that it didn't matter to her at all. The next day, we are transported to see Kim, who put on a hood and looked ahead in front of him. He was standing on a street where there were people and in front of him was a huge building. This place was called the market. On the evening of Valhalla dorm, Kim sat in his room at the computer desk on his phone. Suddenly, he received a notification on his smartphone asking him what he was looking for. Kim tried to search her device for information about where he was going to go. He said that he was trying to find a trading forum where he could sell the treasures from the vault because it was quite an interesting place. I see it, he said. Kim suddenly found what he was looking for and immediately went to this site. It was a website with information on how to get to the same market. Kim used his paintbrush to click directly on this headline. Kim understood what he had learned in the market. After paying the entry fee, it allowed people to freely trade anything from different countries across the continent. Thus, he understood that since this market can be used by anyone around the world, it is considered a black market and the currency that is traded on it. He understood that the reason why an unthinkable market was possible was because the person who created the market was a guardian constellation called the Hidden Rulers. As he thought about it, he rested his hand on his chin and realized that since it was the guardian constellation that created it and actively supports it, high-ranking people use it openly. Kim understood that even though it was illegal, the government didn't fight it. This is also the reason why he can easily find out how to enter it. He looked at the article and realized that he should use it for a while. The author of the article wrote that today he will tell our readers how to get into the open-to-all market. There was nothing special about this method. Users had to click on the link in the comments and reserve a seat. Then, all users were given a location within 50 kilometers of your current location. Users were advised to follow the coordinates and then go through the door to get to the market itself. Kim has fully read what was written in this article. Kim was surprised that this article had a link in the comment itself. He thoughtfully found himself before choosing to follow this link or close it, but his finger reached for the go button. At that moment, Choy Aaron texted him and notifications flashed on his screen with sad bunny emoticons. He immediately asked what had happened to her and she wrote to him that she would not be able to come to tomorrow's training session as she urgently needed to leave. He was happy with this news as he also had to go to the same market and the training would not have happened anyway. Kim wished him a successful trip and in response, she sent him a happy emoticon of the video. Sitting in his chair, Kim was perplexed when he realized that she was still sending him stuff. He couldn't understand why this was happening. But it didn't really matter because the post said that there was a link in the comments where I could reserve seats and find out the location of the market. When he saw the link on his phone, he thought it was her and clicked on it. Meanwhile, he was already on the street and was walking with his hood pulled up, and on the way, he realized that he had to go somewhere without looking at his phone. Lifting his head up and pausing, he realized that the place looked like an old cafe. He went to the same abandoned cafe, which was in complete chaos from the fact that no one was there for a long time. All the chairs were overturned, there were cobwebs, dust, and there was no light. Standing in the middle of the cafe and looking at his phone, he knew that he had to go through and head to the right corner because that's where the place should be. Approaching, Kim opened the door and saw that it led all the way to the backyard. With a puzzled expression, he didn't understand what was going on there. A large alley opened up in front of him. Where the market was located, there were people around and they were all wearing masks to hide their faces. Looking around, he didn't understand why this place felt so familiar since it was his first time here and he had never been there before, but his feelings didn't leave him. In complete shock, he couldn't move and couldn't help but feel the fact that this purple sky above his head and the cloudy moon was too similar to the night sky he had seen 300 years ago. The stranger approached him and asked him if this was the first time Kim was here. Glancing to his left, he looked at the tall young man with red hair in disbelief. He abruptly recalled his last message on his device and emphasized the leather suit this stranger was wearing. The same message said that it was necessary to bring 2 million won and at the entrance to the market, the visitor will be able to see an employee in a leather suit who will wait for money. The rule was that it was an entry fee. Although the market is useful, everyone needs to know that there is a commission of 5% of all funds earned on it. Kim asked if it was the one he read about in the post. The young man in a leather suit responded positively to his question and further clarified, "You already know how to use our market." Kim, pulling his hand out of his pocket, showed him a wad of money and replied that he understood the rules of this market to some extent. Then he handed over all his money to this young man, who responded with gratitude. With a little sadness, I thought that I had spent almost all my money, which I earned by taking first place in the entrance exams. He knew that he only had 30,000 won left, but it gave him the confidence that he could make money here, and he would be alright. The man in the leather suit across from her asked if there was anything Kim wanted to ask him. Holding out his hand, he said that he wanted to sell some of the jewelry he owned, but he didn't know where to go. The man in the suit asked if he wanted to put them up for auction, but the answer was no. Kim wanted to sell them faster. Afterwards, Kim was recommended to go to the market, which was located in the 3rd district, where there are many merchants who buy jewelry and all sorts of things that can only come to your mind. Kim wasn't just going to let this young man go and asked him who was the most reliable person in this row. The man in the suit recommended a salesman named Morris, who was known to have the best prices. At the last moment, he asked where he needed to go to come to the 3rd district. The man in the suit extended a finger and his hand in front of him, pointing to the far passage that was surrounded by houses. He needed to follow straight ahead, and when he saw a fork in the road, he had to turn right. After that, the man in the suit informed him that this was not all and handed him a purple mask of a dark purple panther. He strongly recommended that he use this mask here, adding that due to the nature of the goods sold at the market, all visitors and sellers mostly wear masks. Kim, wrapping his hands around this mask, looked at it for a very long time, and in response he was told that it should be thought of as a small gift. Then he leaned it against his face and closed his eyes, thanking the man in a leather suit. After saying goodbye, Kim started exploring the 3rd district to get to the right seller. Along the way, he met various sellers and buyers who were looking for the goods they needed, and each one he examined in detail. When he saw a man who was wearing a white mask and was examining the diamond with a tool, he asked if this person was Morris. Morris, looking at him, said positively that he was the one he was looking for. Kim, bowing his head in front of him, informed him that he had a few items that he wanted to sell right now and invited him to look at them. Morris said it all depends on the items, but if it's gold or jewelry, he can evaluate them very quickly. Meanwhile, Kim had already taken out his backpack and was looking for jewelry in it. He pulled out a black bag and tossed it on the table, saying that he wanted to sell them. Morris opened the bag in front of him and asked if they were rings. He spent a very long time looking at these ornaments in front of him through binoculars, and then, with great surprise and fright, he shouted out that this was the very artifact of the era of destruction. Meanwhile, he had a red emerald ring in his hand, which he held very tightly. He looked and realized that no matter which way he looked at it, it was an artifact from the Age of Destruction. He looked at the bag with the others and guessed that the rest were also artifacts from the era of destruction. He looked at the bag of rings, and they shone brightly. He looked at them, his face changing. He was very surprised because they were all from the first era. Then someone called out to him, and he turned around in surprise. It was Kim, who was approaching him with his hand in his pocket. He asked how much he could offer him. Morris raised a hand to his chin and asked him to wait a second. He thought about it and didn't understand how he had so many artifacts from the first era, because judging by his voice, he was only a little over 20. He looked up and asked where Kim got all these artifacts from. Morris put his head down on the rings and said that he was right and it was his mistake. He began to take a closer look at the ring and realized that he was so distracted by these artifacts that he asked something he shouldn't have, and he almost tarnished his reputation as a merchant in the marketplace. He raised his head and said that he didn't know how much it might have cost, and he pushed the bag of rings away and said that you couldn't estimate them because they were artifacts from the Age of Destruction. What Morris said was that he didn't have the funds to buy these artifacts from him. Kim picked up the bag of rings and thought about the Age of Destruction. Kim looked at him and asked where he should have gone to get money for all these artifacts. Morris pointed to the side and said that on the way here, he should have passed by that tall building. It was an auction hall. Kim looked at him and asked if he put them all up for auction, how long would it take for him to sell them and get paid. Morris looked at him and said that on average it took about 2 or 3 weeks, because there were so many people who had reserved their seats and it would take some time before the auction hall opened. Kim looked at him and realized that then he would have to come to the market in person. Morris looked ahead and said that he would need to go through verification to receive the payment. Kim looked down and said it was a terrible pain. Kim said that even though Morris couldn't estimate the artifacts, how much he could earn from the auction for them. Morris thought about it and invited him to take a look. He opened the phone and typed in the amount. He showed the phone to Kim and said that he could earn about that much if he went to the auction with them. Who was surprised, he did not understand whether they really cost so much and where such a price came from. Kim assumed that these artifacts were also expensive in his previous life, so he kept them away. He looked at Morris and asked if that was the exact price. Morris put his hand to his chin and thought about it. He said that the price was not quite accurate, but it was his personal estimate, and if he put them up for auction, it would be a completely different story. Morris said that if he sold everything he owned, he would only be able to buy 3/4 of the total value of these jewels. Kim looked at him and asked if that was really the case. After that, he said that then he would sell as much as he could pay for them. Morris stood up in shock. Destruction-era artifacts were sold at a high price not only because of their time period, but also for one other reason. It was thanks to constellations that started appearing after the end of that era. It was strange enough that the artifacts that appeared in that era reacted. Morris took the ring again and stared at it, because a powerless person was able to make a contract with an S-rank constellation. Thanks to this artifact, if he remembered correctly, it was called the Alchemist's Zone. As far as Morris is remembered, he is very active as a contractor. Morris held the ring, and it gave off a purple aura. Morris stared at it closely, and upon re-examining it, he was sure that it was from that era as well, judging by the way the mana was flowing in it. The magic that was released at the end of the Age of Destruction still seemed to be working, Morris thought. An artifact of that era must have the marks. 8 artifacts of that era who knew that he would be able to buy so cheap. He put the ring in the bag, and the rest of the ring. He thought about how today was his lucky day. Morris saw a dark shape approach him, and he raised his head to see who it was. But immediately, his expression changed, and he was very surprised when he saw a uniformed man with a cat mask in front of him. Then we see Kim come through the door. He took off his mask and exhaled. He said it was so uncomfortable that I think he's going to die soon. He looked to the side and saw scattered chairs and a table. He said that if I remember correctly, if he went out through the door he entered through, he would return to the same place. He looked and it seemed to him that this is really the cafe. He opened the phone, where there was a transaction history. He looked and said that the money problem was solved. He didn't think that he would be able to earn so much money in such a short time. He walked forward, looking at his phone and realizing that even if he ran out of money, there were still a lot of expensive and rare things in his storage. He was walking forward and his phone started vibrating, which surprised Kim, and he couldn't figure out who was calling him because he didn't know the number. He looked at the unknown number that called him and answered. He held the phone to his ear and answered. He received a call from a satisfied teacher, Lilia. She greeted Kim and asked him what he was doing. Afterward, she suggested that we eat together. Kim stood in the middle of the street and asked how she got his number. Lilia thought about it and said that she was an instructor in Valhalla, and anyway she said it didn't matter. She offered to go to his lunch and told him to come to the Valhalla fitness hall. Lilia said she'd buy him lunch. Kim apologized to her and then looked at the phone with displeasure and said that he didn't have time to finish, and she hung up. He kept walking forward and wondered if he should have gone to get a free meal, considering that he was completely free right now. After that, we are transported to Morris, who was confronted by an unknown masked man. Morris asked why he was here. Unknown people asked if their relationship was really that bad. Morris looked ahead and said that even if they saw each other several times, an ordinary merchant couldn't just talk to the owner of the market. This unknown person was the owner of the Black Cat Black Market. The Black Cat looked at Morris and said something that he really liked the way he talked to him. Morris stood in front of him and listened in silence. He looked at him and asked why the Black Cat was here. The Black Cat put his hand on the table and said he was just curious. It seemed to him that for the first time in a long time, Morris had submitted an anonymous bid to participate in the auction. Morris was surprised by this. He looked ahead and said that he had assumed that the anonymous application was actually not anonymous at all. Black Cat presented his hand to the mask and said that since the real owner of the market was not him, but also his constellation, he could find out any information. After that, we see the system panel on which it was written, "Your constellation wants to get the ring." This message was repeated many times. Black Cat stood in front of the system panel holding the ring in his hands and said that it was obvious that his constellation really wanted this ring. Then we see Kim, who was sitting at the table with Lily. They were in a restaurant inside Valhalla. There were dishes on their table, as well as pizza. Lilia picked up the pasta with a spoon and spun it around on her fork. Then she brought it to her mouth and ate it. She smiled and said it was delicious, and Kim turned to the side and said nothing. Lilia noticed this and looked away and thought about it. She saw that Kim hadn't touched his food and asked why he didn't want to eat. Kim continued to look away and said that he was just wondering why there was such a place in Valhalla. Lilia stretched out her index finger and said with a smile that in addition to the school cafeteria and the faculty restaurant, there were also faculty restaurants. She asked if he didn't know about it. Kim handed me a map and said he wasn't interested. He tasted the food and asked why the teacher had called him here. Lilia closed her eyes and said that was what she wanted to talk about. Kim started pulling a slice of pizza, and Lilia got up and asked him to be her assistant. Kim said he didn't want to. Lilia stood at the table and urged him to at least think about this offer before giving her such a cold answer. She said that if he became her assistant, he would have many advantages over the average student. Kim took a bite of his pizza and listened to everything she said. Lilia said that when Na invited him to have dinner outside the house and he agreed, she asked if he didn't understand what they were going to talk about. She told him to at least listen to what she had to say. Kim sat silently listening to everything. Then he asked what the advantages were. Lilia smiled and again got up from the table with an outstretched finger and said that first of all he would be given a scholarship, and this was already a very huge plus. Kim wasn't surprised and asked what would happen next. Lilia said that he would also have the opportunity to write a thesis together with her, and if he wrote a thesis, he would be able to open up new horizons for himself. Kim closed his eyes and continued eating. The teacher said that if all of this happened, then his name would become famous throughout the institute and monster research, hence the wealth and honor that would naturally follow him. Kim wasn't surprised anyway, so he asked what would happen next. Lilia said that instead of being allowed to go out once a month, he would be able to go out more than 2 times a week. Kim finished a slice of pizza and asked what else would be waiting for him. Lilia paused, offering her hand to Chin and telling him that he could work with her. Kim picked up the cutlery and was about to eat the main course. I told him that he thought she was just being narcissistic. Lilia slapped the table and begged him to be her assistant again. Kim watched in silence, then presented a fork of macaroni to the map and said he didn't want to. In his head, he knew that if he could get any great benefit out of it, he would think about the offer again, but there was nothing special about it that he would need. He ate the food and imagined the system message and understood that what was important to him right now was just find the eye of the great forest that was sent to him. He could only get there during the assessment of academic performance in the first year. Kim said that in any case, he didn't plan on being her assistant and didn't plan on writing a thesis. This made the teacher angry. Lilia looked at him and said that she still had one sentence. She asked if he also wanted to exchange information. Kim continued to eat his food in silence, and the teacher suggested that if it gave him information that interested him in return, he should give information about how to hunt monsters. Kim asked what kind of information there was. Lilia said with a smile that this information is about the Choy Aaron that he interacted with. Kim thought about it and assumed that she only interacted with him because of training. Then he said he wasn't interested. Lilia said that she had heard that Choy Aaron would soon be kicked out and her family. Kim put his hands on the table and said okay. He got up from the table and said he would go. The teacher stood up and held out her hand to them and asked where he was going. Kim looked in her direction and said that since he had finished eating and he hadn't heard anything useful, he would go. Lilia stood with her hands on the table and said that she had given him the same information, so he should do the same for her. Kim looked at her and said that he didn't want to hear this information. Lilia said that he had listened to her after all. Kim looked at her differently. He said that there was something that he was really interested in. He said that if a teacher acts like a child when she fights, why is she so strict when teaching students? The teacher gave him a serious look and said that it was because she was the most responsible instructor, and if she messed around too much while teaching, then the students might have some problems. She looked to the side and said that, in fact, monster hunting was directly related to the students' survival rate, and if she became lenient during training, then the students wouldn't be able to remember their target and might be in danger while hunting all sorts of monsters. Kim looked at her and said that she was just playing with the concept. Lilia smiled and said that wasn't the case. She said that she was just doing her job as an instructor. Kim smiled and asked if it was really like that, then said that it was really cool. He turned to the side and headed for the exit. He raised his hand and told her to cheer up. Lilia called out to Kim and walked over to him. She said that he should have at least repaid her for the information she gave him. Kim put his hands in his pockets and continued walking towards the exit, saying that he didn't have to do anything. After that, we are transported and see a huge building. It was Sehyun, the Choyjin clan. We see a man who was sitting at a table and there were two people opposite him. He looked ahead and said that the reason he called them today was to ask them about his intentions before the selection of their family's heir began. This man was wearing a kimono and had gray eyes. He was in the Jeans Guild as a guild master, Choyjin clan patriarchy. His name was Choy Jongseok. The guy in the shirt looked at him. He was a hunter of the Kinsa Guild, the eldest son of the captain of the Choyjin Po family. He had the same dark hair as Jongseok. This guy's name was Choy Jinon. Also sitting nearby was a girl who was the second daughter of the Choyjin family, Choy Aaron. Joe took up the sword and said that if you passed the selection tests, they would be able to sign contracts using the Blue Moon sword, which was a sacred relic. He took out his katana and stood in front of them. He said it was a token of recognition to their rightful family heirs. Afterward, he put the katana back and said that if they didn't pass, then according to family tradition, they would be excluded from their family. He gave them a stern look and asked if they still wanted to pass this test. The eldest son stood up and immediately said that she wanted to pass the test. Aaron also said that she would do it. Joe approached Aaron while emitting a vicious aura and handed her the sword. He closed his eyes and said it was good. Both looked at them and said they would start the qualifying test in 3 weeks, then said they were free. After that, Aaron and Jing walked forward together. He asked Aaron if she was really that insensitive. Aaron looked up and asked what he meant. Jing turned around and asked didn't she see the look on her father's face when she said that she was going to participate in the selection trials. Aaron thought for a moment, then remembered her father's angry face. Jing smiled and said that he thought she really wouldn't stop until she achieved a position in the family. Aaron stood in front of him, clenching her fists and listening to everything he said to her. Jing said that even though she was an illegitimate child, she wanted it. Aaron got angry at this and silently looked at Jing, who was saying nasty things to her face with a malicious smile. He told her to look at his expressionless face. Afterward, he told her not to expect that she would be able to win the selection process, because she who only had constellation protection wasn't on par with him who had a normal contract. He walked up to her and looked at her with a haughty face. Aaron hung her head down and Jing said that in any case, since she had given up and sat and watched her family's money being squandered, he would make her realize the cost of all this. After that, he opened the door and closing it looked at her with a sharp look and said that they would see each other in 3 weeks. Aaron continued to stand where she was. She recalled how the woman lay exhausted and called the name Aaron. Little Arena was standing nearby, holding the woman's hand and crying. The woman said that she was supposed to be the head of the family and it would be nice if she was in this position and did whatever she wanted. Then Aaron closed her eyes and opened them, looking ahead. After that, we are transferred to Class 1, where Kim and other students watched Ligon write information on the blackboard. I sat in silence and watched it all. Barch said that Kim's midterm exams will start soon. I was surprised by this and asked if he was really worried about it. While Ligon took the board and explained the material, Barch said that he should have been more careful. Afterward, he asked if his homeroom teacher didn't explain the midterm exam. I asked if it was true. He said that he usually didn't pay attention to classes. Ligon looked at the class and said that not everyone should have known by now, but in Algalai's case, the exams were of great importance. The entire class sat and listened intently to Ligon. Ligon said that in both the midterm and final exams, the students who scored the lowest score would be immediately expelled from the school, after which he said that they should all do their best. Kim looked ahead and listened to the teacher. Ligon said that he really hopes that they will all prepare for the written and practical tests. After telling the teachers to do their best, Kim just stared ahead. He knew in his mind that in practice, the test was not as important as the written test. He knew that he should have stayed in this school until he got to the window of the Great Forest, but he doesn't even know how he got there. Then it dawned on him. Barch stood with his hands clasped in front of him, and Kim asked him if he had ever attended all of these classes before. Barch said that he probably attended all the classes, then asked what he was up to. Barch was shocked when he found out what he was up to. Kim said that then he would write the test for him. Barch asked how he planned to do it. Kim sat at the desk with his hand under his head and said that he would just write this dough instead of him. Barch folded his hands and said that he didn't like his plan at all and found it unfair. Barset was terrified when she heard what Kim said and imagined his angry face. Kim asked if it wasn't fair. After that, he said that he would still write the test, and the other person would tell him the answers, so he would write the test for him. Ligon stood in front of the classroom with a folder and said that this was the end of today's class and he wished good luck to all the students. The students thanked him and Kim started to get up and grab his briefcase. After someone called out to him, he turned to the side in surprise. Awen came up to him and Kim asked why she had called him. Awen looked at him and asked if they were going to train today. Kim looked at her and asked why she was asking him. He asked if she really wanted to finish their training. Awen was standing in front of Kim, who had his hands in his pockets, and she said that wasn't the case at all. Kim asked what was going on then. Awen looked at him in surprise when Kim suggested that she wanted to learn swordsmanship. Kim looked at her and said that he thought it was time to talk to her about it. He said that since she had trained with him, she probably didn't even know how to use a sword. Kim stood picking her ear. He said that it wasn't really a sword art back then, but he would show her how to wield a sword. Kim looked in her direction and reflected that it was also a good time for him to practice with his weapon. He looked at Awen, who was glowing with happiness, and he told her to come to the training hall. Awen said she would come. After that, we are transported to the training hall and see Awen standing in front of Kim, who was holding a weapon in his hands. He pointed at her while holding his sword in his other hand and asked her how long it had been since she had last used her weapon. Awen looked at it and said it's been a day and a half. She said she hasn't touched it since she started training with Kim. Kim looked at her and told her that she had been training every day before. Awen said it was like that. Kim then pointed at her and told her to draw her sword. Awen gripped the hilt of her sword and drew her sword in front of Kim. Kim pointed to the way he held the sword and told her to focus on the ring finger and little finger and hold the hilt of the sword tightly. Awen looked surprised at the way she was holding the sword and said ring and pinky. She noticed that her grip had suddenly tightened and was surprised. Awen stared at her sword and it was as if she could feel the aura change completely. She thought about it and realized that she had never put magic into it, but it was more reliable and stable than holding the blade with both hands. Kim looked at her and said that now she should attack him with everything she had. Awen looked at him and agreed. She shoved her sword back in and took a stance in front of Kim. She said she was ready, and standing in her stance was like letting out lightning bolts from her body, after which she started to unsheath her sword and looked down in surprise and thought about her leg speed. She threw a punch, I think, but he raised his arm with agility and blocked Awen's attack. And the siren started to shake and Kim looked at her with a smile and said that she was much faster than she was before. After Awen jumped back and Kim swung his sword. He told her not to put more magic into her legs than she needed to. Awen jumped back, holding her sword in the palm of her hand, and said that she would do her best. She shoved her sword back in and took a step forward, after which she lunged and sped up towards Kim. She swung a swing at Kim, who stepped out of the way with agility. He looked at it all with a smile and said that she was moving much better. He tightened his grip on his sword and said that when she stopped, she needed to turn her body a little more. After that, he struck the sword and it began to fall back. Awen rose to her feet, and the hand holding her sword began to shake. She held it with her other hand and said that she would consider everything he said. Kim started kneading his shoulder and with a smile told her to attack him again and told her not to stop. Awen gave him a serious look and exhaled. Then she walked towards him and their swords crossed again. They began to rub against each other and create sparks. Awen threw another one punch towards Kim, but he passed out of reach and her sword went towards the floor and chipped off part of the tile. Kim stood up, looking confidently at Awen, who was holding her sword on the floor. Awen raised her sword again and said in her mind that everything was as expected. She looked at him confidently and started swinging. She threw another one punch towards Kim and realized that thanks to training, she is now much stronger than she was before. She carried a lot of punches to him, but he easily blocked everything while looking at her. Then they crossed their swords again, and Kim looked her straight in the eye with confidence. After that, we see the Valhalla building and it was already evening outside. We see the sign of the training hall. There was Kim, who was facing Aaron, who was exhausted and standing on the cut floor. Her body was still shaking, and she was clearly tired. Kim threw his head back on his shoulder and said that it had already been an hour, then suggested that we leave it at that. Awen agreed and fell to the floor, trying to catch her breath. She looked at Kim as he walked over to the booth and put down his weapon. Awen thought about it and realized that her swordsmanship was much better than ever. This was incomparable to her swordsmanship during the entrance ceremony. She looked ahead as he flexed his arms and realized that even so, she couldn't touch him. She started wiping away her sweat and said that of course she had asked him to teach her how to fight. She called out, and he looked at her questioningly. She stood in front of him holding her weapon and asked if he would spar with her next time. Kim put his hand under his chin and said, "I don't know." He thought about it and realized that, of course, sparring with Awen was very useful and teaching her was very fun since she had a talent. He watched Awen draw her sword and thought that he had sensed it during the entrance ceremony, and she was familiar with the art of swordsmanship. He knew she was using a breathing technique, but it felt different. He folded his hands in front of him and looked at her with a smile. He knew that in any case, thanks to their training, it helped him relax. If it was 300 years ago, she would have been a talent worthy of becoming his disciple as well, but unfortunately, he didn't have the opportunity to do so now. Awen looked at him and asked if they would be transmitted. Kim looked at her idly with a smile and wanted to play a little joke. After that, he said he didn't want to do it. Awen said with a straight face that she understood everything. Kim desperately asked if she was really giving up so quickly. Awen looked at him and said that he was absolutely right. She sincerely looked ahead and realized that if she followed Kim's words, she would definitely become even stronger. Kim looked at her and repeated her words. He didn't understand what she meant, that he was right. After that, Kim said that that's all for today, and Awen said that we won't see each other again. After that, we move forward 2 weeks. We see a lot of people standing together in the stadium in Valhalla. Soyan stood near the crowd and held her sword and said it was her first time at the stadium since the entrance ceremony. Senyuk also stood among the crowd and asked if all the freshmen were really here. He said he didn't know there would be so many of them. Awen stood confidently, looking ahead, and said nothing. Kim stood in the middle of the crowd with his hands in his pockets and asked why they were all here. Barch said that the homeroom teacher also told them about this 2 weeks ago, and he asked me what happened 2 weeks ago. After which, a loud voice rang out that said attention. Lai confidently stood idly by with Ligong and Lilia. Lee said that now he will tell all the students about the midterm exams in Valhalla. The students stood there listening intently to everything he said. Lai said that this time, the mid-stage practical assessment was dungeon attack. After that, the floor began to shake over the students, and they were all surprised. Lee said that not everyone will team up and go to the artificial dungeons. Then a building with a door appeared. The students were standing in a pile, and many dungeons appeared around them. Liam watched and said that they were free to create any team they wanted. He said they thought it was best to have 8 people on the team, but they can decide to increase or decrease that number. Kim looked ahead and listened in silence to what Lee was saying. Lai said that they would only rate them based on their contribution level during the dungeon attack, and the disqualification criteria were as follows. A system board appeared above it, where the time was set to 5 o'clock. Lai stood in front of them menacingly and told them that if they didn't finish in the allotted time, they would be thrown out of the exam. Soyan was surprised enough when she heard that the difficulty of the dungeon was equal to rank F. Lee looked at them confidently and said that they were starting the exam. After that, the time began to go on the scoreboard. Lee and the teachers watched as the students immediately hesitated and started looking for a team. They were shouting out if they were going to join their team. Ligon looked at Lai and said what he expected. They were all excited. Lee agreed with this, but then he looked surprised and said that this could not be the case. Soyan held out her hand and said that the dealer and the team weren't good enough and they needed someone else. A student ran up and said he could do it. A dealer was a person who carried the main damage in battle. Soyan looked away and knew that she didn't have to choose someone better than her. She understood that 5 hours was enough for 8 people in an F-rank dungeon. She looked at the student who was standing together with the girl and realized that the main teamwork. It was clear to her that with a group of 6 people, they could handle it and it looked simple, but the main thing was to show their abilities. After that, she waved her hand forward and shouted that they should go. Lee watched it all and realized in his mind that it was as he expected. If the student was a child and came from an influential family, then the essence of the exam was clear to them, but the rest of the students were not so simple. He looked at the crowd of students who were entering the dungeon and realized that they were entering 20 people at a time, while others were entering groups of 8 people. He looked at the students who decided who would go with them and realized that if the team was not balanced enough, then fights and eternal disputes would start among them, and this was a frequent occurrence. Ligong looked at Lai, who said that in about 30 minutes, all the participating students would enter the dungeon. He suggested that they get ready and start counting their points. Kim stood one on the field and watched as all the students scattered, looking for a group and entering the dungeon. He looked to the side and didn't know if the students who entered immediately received points or not. Aaron also stayed behind while Napoli looked after the other students. Kim approached Aaron and asked her if she still hadn't entered either. Kim looked at her and said that almost everyone had entered, and then he asked her what she was going to do there. Aaron looked at him and said that she would do what he told her. Kim kept his hands in his pockets and looked at her in shock. He didn't understand what was happening to her. He assumed that she was trying to follow his words from the last training sessions. Kim looked at Aaron and said that he would go there one, so she should have gone too. Kim closed his eyes and walked forward with his hands in his pockets. Aaron looked at him and asked, "So you should also go to one?" Kim said, and it didn't look difficult either. Aaron was watching the first show one in the dungeon. She stared at it all in silence, then the students were standing in the back and one of them asked if it wasn't Choy Aaron. Another said that this was exactly what it was, but he did not understand why it was standing one. He didn't know if she really didn't have a team. One of the students approached her with a smile and asked her, "Aren't you Choy Aaron?" Aaron looked at him in surprise. The student smiled and pointed at her group and said that if she didn't have a team, then they had a suggestion that she join them, because at the moment there were exactly 7 people, and if she joined, then there would be 8. Aaron looked at them and apologized. She said that she would go to dungeon 1. She headed towards the dungeon and started opening the doors. The student stretched out his hand in shock and told her not to go crazy because she was disqualified. Aaron, looking ahead, said that she could do it because Kim said that it was not so difficult. The student held out his hand in shock and asked what she was talking about, then she slammed the door behind her. We see the stadium of poles and which is completely empty. After that, we are transported to the observation room, where teachers and other people were standing watching the screens, on which there were students who were passing through the dungeon meeting various monsters. Ligon stood with a clipboard and stared ahead in silence. On the system screen, the students who had met the goblin could be seen growling menacingly. A student stood at the front, holding his sword. It was Yun Kyan Hyan, who scored 2 points. There was a girl standing nearby who was scared and holding onto her backpack. It was B. Yeji, who earned 3 points. There was a confident student standing nearby who was looking ahead. It was Yoon Jinsu, who earned 1 point. Lee stood and watched all these students. Ligon watched as Lai extended his finger and watched the students. Ligon said that everything was as he expected. This was a rough estimate that made people think that everything was too harsh, but they estimated so quickly and accurately without any mistakes. Lee stood with his arm outstretched and watched the information on the screens. When Instructor Lee was a soldier, they called him the Sweep Master. He was a legendary soldier with a dungeon clearing rate of 99%. Ligon looked at him and said that was why he thought he understood the essence of dungeon attacks better than anyone else. This is how he could give such points to students. He watched the way he watched the students and said that this is what he should be respected for. Lee watched with the students and said in her mind that it was generally a very good year. He observed the students who were from noble families and thought that the children from the 5 great families did quite well for the task, and there was a wonderful student among them. He looked at the screen where Soyan was holding out her hand and giving orders. She shouted at the tank to block the front line. They were standing right in front of the students who were trying to defend themselves. She shouted for the archers to kill those who attacked from the sides. After that, the goblins swung their bats and charged. Students were going to defend themselves with their shields. Soyan clenched her hand into a fist and shouted that the front line must never fall. She shouted for the archers to shoot, and the students started shooting at the goblins. The arrows landed on the goblins' bodies and wounded them a little. After that, Soyan leapt into the attack, swinging her sword and slashing at the goblin, killing it. It fell to the ground and began to evaporate into blue particles. Lee watched it all through the system screen and thought how amazing it was. He understood that the students were good at clearing the dungeon, and thinking about Soyan, he understood that she had assigned certain roles to her team members and made moves that would undoubtedly earn points. And she was also very good at guiding her team members to make sure that they completely cleared the dungeon. He raised his index finger and started tapping on the system screen. He looked through Soyan's screen and realized that if she did well in the midterms anyway, it was only a matter of time before it rose to the top. Recalls Kim's first battle in the exam, where he easily defeated her and, if not for someone during the entrance ceremony, was not tainted. He smashed Kim's name on the system screen and clicked search. He wondered how he was doing. He clicked on the button. The new system panel said that nothing was found. Lee looked at it in surprise and didn't understand what the problem was, since it was a search engine that could find any information about all the students who entered the dungeon. Lee looked at the system screen and started to figure out the problem there. He couldn't believe what he saw. System message midterm exam list of artificial dungeon. He looked at the list of artificial dungeons and ranked number 1 was Kim, who cleared the dungeon in 23 minutes and 32 seconds. When he saw it, he couldn't believe that he had already cleared the dungeons alone without any groups. Lee stood there watching it all. What completely surprised him was when he looked at the time it took him to complete it. He began to carefully study the information on the system screen and realized that no matter how impressive the entrance ceremony was, it wasn't something that a 17-year-old high school student could do. He looked at all of this and realized that he needed to watch the footage of him clearing the dungeons. He looked at the video of Kim defending the dungeon, then opened it. Kim stood with his sword in his hand. He was looking at the goblins that were ahead of him and glaring at him viciously. Kim closed his eyes and started to adjust his arm, after which he ran towards the goblins. They looked at him angrily, then started shouting and also went in Kim's direction. Kim started swinging his sword with a smile on his face, and then he threw a punch that went right through the 2 goblins and easily destroyed them. The goblin fell to the floor and began to grunt. Kim easily endured slashing attacks with his sword with a smile, and he said that he really enjoyed slashing stone goblins. After that, he stood up and looked with a serious face at the 2 goblins who were standing in front of him. They were much bigger than him and swung their bats. They started throwing punches with a snide smile, but when they landed the punches, Kim wasn't on the ground. Their blow landed on the floor, and Kim was already on top of them, swinging to take down the unsuspecting goblins. He threw a slash and sliced through the orcs. Lai, along with Ligong and Lilia, looked at all this and had only one thought in his head: this is cutting. After which, someone started to step forward, in front of whom was a huge incomprehensible monster in iron armor. Lee watched it all and began to think. This type of golem that was modeled specifically for the midterm exam was standing right in front of Kim. He said that this guy had improved his stats to match the required number of 8 people. The golem started to swing its arm to slay Kim, but Kim reached out with a smile and stabbed directly at it. Kim's sword emitted a bright red light. After that, the golem's head fell to the floor, and its body slowly began to split into pieces. Lee, when he saw this, closed his eyes and realized that he had cut the golem with ease. He opened his eyes and realized that it looked like the first place in this midterm exam would go to him. Kim stood there with complete confidence, looking away. After which, the students who were completely beaten and tired started to come out of the dungeon. Then the other students started to come out, and they were very happy that they were able to clear the dungeon. After a group of Soyan came out, she was staring intently ahead. Then Seniuk's group and Aaron. Kim stood with his hands in his pockets, looking ahead. The midterms were over. Ligon entered the staff room with a clipboard in his hands. He was looking at the midterm exam results. Kim was in first place, followed by Aaron, Soyan, and Seniuk, among others. Ligon stared at the exam results in silence, and he walked over to Lai. Ligon said the results have been published. He looked at the results and said they got unexpected results. Ligon said that Kim took first place. Lee folded his hands in front of him and said with his eyes closed that it was quite unexpected. Ligon looked at Lee with a straight face and silently recalled how Kim deftly dealt with the dungeon. Lee said that he really didn't expect Kim to be ranked number 1, but no one would have thought that he would be able to easily pass the dungeons on his own and that he hadn't suffered any injuries yet. Lee looked ahead and said that when he grew up, he would enter the industry in Korea, would be able to reclaim the title The Only Thing. Ligon stood in front of him and held out his hand. He asked if this wasn't the title given to the strongest contractor in the world. Lee looked at him and said he was thinking straight. He said it might have been because he hadn't been a genius among them for a long time. Ligon listened in silence. He looked at the tablet and said that, in addition, the surprise of the second exam was someone else. Lee, without waiting for an answer, said with a serious face that it was student Choy Aaron. Ligong looked at the midterm exam results in passing time. The topic was incredible, but they didn't think that Aaron would beat Soyan and take second place among everyone. Lee said that he didn't know what happened with, but Aaron couldn't handle the dungeon alone either. Aaron easily defeated the dungeons and it took her very little time to deal with him. She certainly suffered a lot, but she still cleared the dungeons and took second place. Ligon stared at Lee in silence, holding the clipboard in his hands and listening intently. Lee said that he knew that Aaron was a very quiet and hardworking student, but he wouldn't have thought that she was the type of person who could clear dungeons alone. Lee hung his head down and confidently said that if this exam was focused on teamwork, then Soyan would definitely have scored higher, but Kim and Aaron got better grades because it was only focused on their contribution level. Lee looked up and said there was one thing, but he would not recommend their methods to his students. Ligong looked at Lai with a straight face, and Lai said that this was not something that students could usually successfully repeat. Ligon, holding the tablet in his hands, agreed with him. He looked at the tablet and thought about it. He knew that he had definitely seen Aaron when he was the head of the Choyjin Guild. She had the aura of a young student who only practiced swordsmanship, but he didn't understand how she came up with the idea to go through the dungeons alone. I looked down and couldn't believe it was because of Kim. Ligon closed his eyes and put his hand to his head. He said that it just couldn't be and he wasn't thinking about it, he thought that he needed a rest. After that, we see the sunset that illuminated the buildings of Valhalla. Then the next day, a lot of students stood in front of the blackboard and watched the results. The results were put up on a board and the names of Kim and Aaron were written on it. Rockell and Yuri were standing next to the board and Rockell was very angry about it. He called out to Yuria and asked if Desir was in Korea right now. Yuria said that was exactly what happened. Rockell, with a vicious face, told her to call him right away, then told her they were leaving. Then we are transported to Seoul and see a huge building. Next, we see Rockell and Yuri enter the building and the butler worships them. Then someone raised a hand and called out to Rockell, calling him brother. It was Desir Ventrich. He was sitting at a table in a white suit and he had rings on his fingers. Rockell sat down opposite Desir and Yuria stood next to him. Afterward, they began to eat their food. Desir took a piece of steak and began to eat it greedily. Rockell watched it all in silence. After dessert, he started talking and Rockell looked at him. Desir, holding the cutlery, said that the guy Rockell asked to take care of was Kim. Desir asked who he was. Rockell smiled and said that there was nothing special about him, he was just a brainless freshman. Desir closed his eyes and continued eating while listening to Rockell tell him about his goal. Rockell said that Kim just really disappointed him because of his humble background, so he wants him to deal with him. Desir glared at him and asked if he could have killed him. Rockell looked at him with a smile and said that it was up to him to decide. Desir got up from the table and said that this was different from last time and he should prepare for this occasion. Desir looked ahead and asked what that meant. Desir stretched out his index finger and pointed directly at Yuri who was standing next to him. Desir said that because of this woman that he had to deal with a long time ago, he had a big fight with the Felix family. Yuri started to tremble and look down. Desir said that maybe because there weren't many people in the Felix family, he couldn't kill anymore because the rumors spread too far. Desir continued eating the food and said that the people in Valhalla were very different and no matter how often he did it, it was very difficult to get there and make a complete mess. Rockell looked at Desir who was eating the food and said that he understood everything. Yuri was standing behind him, looking down in horror, and Rockell said with a smile that he would do everything possible to prepare the ground for it. Rockell said that Desir didn't have to worry about it at all. Desir smiled and said that it was just fine. He said to prepare him a good reward for this case. After that, we move on to the next week. Kim was holding up a statement. He was walking down the corridor and talking to Barch. Barch asked this statement was in order to go outside again. Kim said that was exactly what happened. Barch idly asked if he hadn't been walking recently. Kim said that this was indeed the case, but he needed to go outside again. Kim walked down the corridor and looked ahead. Barch said that he had heard that for successfully passing the exam, he would be given one more exit permit. Kim said it was just like that, and he couldn't let this opportunity pass, so he needed to find his notes. Barch looked ahead and asked where he was going. Then we see the building. It was Soyan. Kim was wearing a hood and walking through the woods with his phone in front of him. He said he assumed the place must have been here. He was looking at the phone when someone called out to him. Kim confidently looked up and saw Desir standing in front of him, looking at Kim with a malicious look on his face, smiling. He asked how he was doing.